for this week, we were returning to Mythos and Logos. Well, from here on, unless Kenneth gets, we're not aware of him about to pounce on us with another chapter of Contra Kant. So unless he surprises us all, I think we'll actually manage to get through in the next few weeks. We'll manage to get through all of Mythos and Logos, and wrap it up. I have theories about what we could do next if you guys are interested. Kenneth did a series called Characterology on human natures, where he talks about the douloi, the banausoi, and the aristoi, and how they work and what the different mental faculties are and different forms of culture associated with them. And it feels like that's a very good fit with, hi Joseph, very good fit with Mythos and Logos. And that's another book I'd like to bring out. So maybe that could be the follow-up. Donald, go ahead.
Yeah, I of all the things I've read from Kenneth, that almost like the first thing one needs to read, because the conclusions of that paper are assumed in everything else I think I've read by him. And I always love it when the arguments start to really go about slavery, or not slavery. He doesn't talk about slavery in there. He talks about slavish personalities, slavish characters.
Yes.
Which is really good. It's almost as fun as taking up the Nicomachean Ethics and Aristotle's defense of actual slavery, which
very unsettling.
which until you realize that maybe I should find an Aristoid to guide my life, I would be doing better.
If only our epoch had not nearly exterminated them all, and the ones who are left are all poor and mentally ill, stressed out of their minds.
Right.
All we have are damaged Aristoi that nobody wants to follow because you need a lot of therapy afterwards. So it's like one of the things he talks about is the way that once you distinguish the three major epochs of European society, which we've talked about in terms of sources of meaning, but they can also be characterized by the rise of which character types who respond to those sources of meaning and who then dominate those epochs. And it's in that he becomes clear about how medievalism was hostile to the Aristoi. Because of all the corruption in the ancient world of people claiming to be Aristoi who were nothing of the sort, and enslaving people who weren't slavish at all and never should have been slaves. And then when they had their slaves, instead of educated them and raising them up to become free and participating citizens, they instead exploited them and did the opposite, held them down, suppressed them in the ways that the modern epoch has so beautifully characterized for us with, and I say beautifully, but I mean it's just like a Holocaust, the catastrophe of New World slavery and how that worked in the world it's just it's the opposite of what Aristotle was advocating. But along with that, was this hostility to the Aristoi. Augustine's city of man versus city of God was his repudiation of Rome's claims to be the best and the brightest, and says, if we hold you up to a real standard of excellence like God, we can see how far you fall short of that. And therefore God should be in charge, and we should let God rule our world and tell us what to do. And obviously Augustine didn't foresee just how badly awry that would go due to the fact that it actually meant exalting human beings who claim to speak for God rather than actually exalting God, and therein lies the corruption, right? So you get the modernist epoch responding against that medieval corruption, but it doesn't do it in a way that reasserts the importance of training people to be Aristoi, or seeking out people who want to do the right thing and are willing to sacrifice for it. Instead, it just comes up with a better way to harness slavish personalities and mass produce them, and strives to exterminate Aristoi as being dangerous because they question things. They're like, well, maybe these social relations aren't good social relations. Maybe what you call the Department of Justice actually is for injustice. and maybe we should change some things in the world. And so people who want an established order they can profit off of tend to despise Aristoi and do everything in their power to exterminate them as a possibility for that culture. And modernism basically went far further down that road than the medieval epoch ever could, because it's so systematic. It's able to create systematized education, systematized frameworks for the economy, for politics, and for everything else that just inherently disempower anybody who stops and says, but wait, maybe we shouldn't do things like this. Maybe police departments should be different. Maybe voting should be different. Maybe everything should be different. They're like, shut up, you. Get in your place. You have two choices. You could be a Benausos or you could be a Doulos, but we're not going to have any of that third thing. It's too bad. It's too dangerous. So, yeah, that stuff is all. I mean, I'm sort of, in a long-winded way, I'm sort of trying to agree with you, Donald, that the characterology stuff, we touch on it frequently over the course of the series that we've done in these meetups. It comes up, but we've never put it like fully center the way that I think it will be if we do that after Mythos and Logos. So I think that would be I saw Sharon gave a thumbs up for that, so maybe she's on board with having the sequel to Mythos and Logos that we go through be characterology. So, but speaking of Mythos and Logos, before we dive into Myth, Art, Dreams, which was the chapter we were gonna get into this week, I added a couple of things to the little outline, the capsule Smithian framework, that play right into this, because I was thinking about what was missing from this framework in terms of Mythos and Logos. I wrote this when we were doing Contra Kant, and so we were thinking about the issues raised in that book. So when I thought about Mythos and Logos, it seemed to me that part of the core argument extends beyond the original 7 points. I guess I had 6 points here. I only went as far as the third potential faculty when we were doing Contra Kant. And so there's the 7, 8, 9, and 10 that I've added that extend that idea into Mythos and Logos and why it makes the core argument for Mythos. So if you guys are game, we could talk through 7, 8, and 9, and 10 real quickly, and then dive into the text of Myth, Art, and Dreams? Or would you rather do it the other way around? What do you want to do?
I came prepared with a bunch of well, not a bunch, but just a few notes from Myth, Art, and Dreams.
Okay.
Then
why don't we start there?
We could go through. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Let's do that. That way I don't waste your prep. And I know Sharon always comes into these things with piles of notes too, so I don't want to waste her prep either. so yeah, why don't we go into Myth, Art, and Dreams? We'll start here at the beginning and say, who wants to go first? Who's got a comment from early in the essay that they want to bring up?
Well, I have one early on. I mean, it's kind of anticlimactic, but it's just, and I don't know if it deserves a footnote, but it's more just sort of I guess where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
So on the first page, he lists a bunch of different thinkers starting from Hegel, Marx onwards.
Yeah.
So I recognize all those names, and then except for the last one, that's Philip Reef.
Yes, okay. Philip Reef.
Okay.
Yes. And Philip Reef is best known for Triumph of the Therapeutic. That one has a lot of legs, and people talk about it. But Kenneth Smith often, when he talks about Reef, is actually emphasizing another book of his, The Feeling Intellect. And he cites that phrase as Reef's summation of Vernunft. What happens when you bring Begriff and Verstand together? You get the feeling life, although again, the English words feeling don't do enough justice here to it, but you get the feeling life tied to the rationalized, intellectualized life in a way that creates something new, what Reef calls the feeling intellect. And so that's why Kenneth Smith sees Reef as part of this same ongoing line of existentialist thinkers who are building on Hegel, who was building on Heraclitus. And he cites, there's another one too, and there's a third 20th century thinker, and I mentioned him last week. I keep forgetting. There's Arendt, there's Reef.
Is it Cassirer, or
might be Cassirer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's mentioned later in the in this essay, I think.
Yeah, and Cassirer wrote so much about myth, but he did it from a neo-Kantian perspective, in which he adjusted. Like we said last week, he sort of adjusted Kant and adjusted Plato to try to stand them on their feet and make their material valuable and essential, not just inspiring and interesting, but directly relevant and crucial. But he does it in a way that's still Verstand centered. Cassirer does. In which he's talking about myth as being the model for how the mind works, that you have to take into account because we're not as fully rational as Kant wanted us to be. Therefore, you have to work around this. He sees myth as a problem that has to be addressed. Whereas Smith doesn't. Smith takes it the other way around.
Something foundational that we're kind of going against.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So that's actually right there is sort of a capsule listing of some of the writers who Kenneth Smith thinks are most important to read to understand Smithian existentialism. And some of these were the ones that as an adolescent, he noticed that all the teachers around him were uncomfortable talking about. So he's like, ooh, if it makes them uncomfortable, I want to get good at it. Whatever the adults can't handle, I want to do that. I want to be that guy. And others are people that he discovered along the way. Once he got into it, when he discovered one thing leads to another, he started to trace the relationships. So that's Reef. And you're right. I should have a note that actually spells out more clearly so we know exactly who we mean.
Or I guess it's just more like, him being like the other ones are kind of more iconic, I guess, just from my studies. And so the other, I was just kind of, Reef was to me stuck out as being, more of a question mark. Yeah. But I to someone else or, to Kenneth, who is so widely read, he'll get into more obscure things and but to me it was more obscure, I guess.
At Kenneth's when I first started actually reaching out to Kenneth and talking to him 20 years ago, I bought a bunch of books on his recommendation. Many of them I bought from him, and to try to build up the library so I'd have things that I could dig into and wrestle with. And I ended up with like 6 or 7 books by Reef, but I've only fully read one of them, and I've read samples of others. I read The Feeling Intellect before I ever met Kenneth Smith. That was the one that I actually got through. Not The Feeling Intellect. Triumph of the Therapeutic. Triumph of the Therapeutic was recommended in college. But the others I've only read excerpts. So I'm actually this is my part of reaffirming that I am not Professor Marshall. I'm just another student who's still working on this, like the rest of you are. I'm way behind on my Philip Reef reading.
And on page 29, when Ken Smith mentions all these authors again, Heraclitus, Aristotle, Blake, Hegel, I like how he really summarizes why he brings them up, because they have a cogent paralogic that was meant to insult the delusions of logicism.
Yes.
To see what, he says just here a little bit later, to see what is true and not just what is known.
Yes. That's such a critical paragraph that you're citing there. In the beginning of Otherwise, the kind of Smith book, Otherwise, he has an introduction called Alongside of, in which he introduces what's a paradigm, what's a paradox, what's a parable, the things that he says the book is full of. What are those things? And for each one, after he introduces it, he gives a list of writers who he says were outstandingly good at this. And so, like Jesus and Lincoln come up on some lists and not others. Heraclitus comes up in some lists and not others. And so you can sort of see in that introduction to Otherwise how he's scouting out the material of the writers we should familiarize ourselves with in order to break out of the trap of the logicism that we've been trained into. So like he recommends Borges, for example, as a writer who works at the mythic, who's an artistic fictional mythologizing writer, and that's part of what Kafka's doing here too. Is that Kafka is also trying to tap into the power of mythic perspectives to critique the modern order with them, which I was thinking since we talked last week about this at some length. What Kafka doesn't entirely teach us about mythos because he's doing it from within a logos culture framework. He himself was trained in a logos culture framework, and the subject matter he's writing about is logos culture and logicism. And yet, if you start by taking all that Apollonianism as a given, he's then deploying the techniques of mythos in order to leverage against logicism and try to break it apart. It's the quote that says that a book should be an ice axe to break up the frozen mind within us. That's what he means. He's using mythos itself to try to smash up the frozen, crystalline, pure rigidity of an intellectualized order and intellectualized ways of thinking and experiencing the world. Sharon, you got your hand up.
So I wanted to repeat Dave's sentence, the complete sentence, because I think it dovetails with number 7. You know, on that list that you have, it says to be fit to think actuality as actuality is, to see what is true and not just what is known. Thinking needed to be deepened, radicalized, confronted with principles that work, an utterly different kind of sense and order. And so I think that kind of dovetails with number 7. And because you wanted to discuss it, I think that's like a segue. What are virtues, principles, powers, and why do they matter?
Ooh, you're right. You're right. Because in the modern world, we use the word principle very differently from the more kind of profound meaning that it has. And Kenneth always uses it in the sense that has the deeper, more profound meaning, but we read past it and don't quite see what he's saying. And you're right. This is the tie-in right here. So there's a fundamental problem.
Before we move on, I was just going to ask Rick, the one historical character I'm surprised I don't see specifically with reference to myth is Carl Jung. And I know that he doesn't really speak out against logicism, so his omission, it makes sense. But just in terms of his importance in elevating myth and the importance of myth, I'm just curious that that's not in his pantheon of characters here.
You know what? I'll ask him so we can talk about it next time. I'll call him and ask, why is Jung not on this list, and how does he feel about Jung as an example of one of these? That's a great question, Dave. Thank you. Because now that you bring it up, now I'm struck by it. Marianne, go ahead.
So I was thinking about Jung too, and I've been thinking about The Century of Self, that movie, that documentary, Adam Curtis, and how which showed that as we individualized, the corporations figured out that they could sell us lifestyles. And so that individualism that has been trumped on the US is a marketed thing. And I think that the politicians are now weaponizing our individualism against the consciousness that is trying to establish some kind of sense of morals, like Kant kind of did. We have so customized our religions and our thoughts and individualism. And I think that really it stems from Jung trying, from a Victorian society, trying to individualize himself out of that sense. But so that was my thinking.
Yeah, the weaponization of the sense of individualism and selling lifestyles, that's some potent stuff you're tapping into there. We could do weeks on that. Richard, and then Donald, and then Phil.
My next note was on the next page, like just the mention of Oedipus.
Can we hold that? Because
okay.
we got a line, I think, that you've inspired just by the note we're on at the moment. So
sure,
put a pin in that one, and we'll do that one next.
All right.
Donald, go ahead. You're on mute.
I believe Kenneth almost always uses principle as a translation of the Greek arche.
Yes.
So it has to do with the internal principle guiding the growth through becoming towards some being's telos. So enough Greek, but
no, that's right on the money. That's exactly right. It's
not because in the place where he references here, he sort of says not ideas but principles. But we think of principles as ideas, not as immanent powers of development within organisms.
Yes.
So enough of that, Professor. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, not at all. I mean, after Phil goes, I'm gonna run with what you said there. That's core to answering Sharon's
I like
question.
that, Donald. I like that.
Phil, go ahead.
This might relate to what Donald just said, but I'm coming at it from a point of view of an artist. I always thought that thinking involved three types. One is through language that you could speak, and the other is like those that which you cannot speak, you could only show, which is like mythos in a way. Like what artist does is show it, point to it, say, and sort of. But the third level, it seems to me, what goes beyond that is silence. I'm more interested in the silence because that is what's becoming to be shown, and then maybe at some point to speak about. So it seems to me thus far the discussion, maybe the principal thing gets to it, is that we've left out silence as an important part. Because with silence, all you could do is wonder about it. So the feeling of wonderment is kind of like basic in terms of supporting mythos and logos. And so perhaps you could address that issue, because I'm really interested in that borderline. Yes. I mean, it's kind of like I'm still standing in the city walls between mythos and logos, but I guess I wonder out there that's a little bit like the Zen archer shooting the arrow into the darkness.
Yes.
So I think that's an important issue to address, because it goes even beyond mythos.
Yeah. So let's explore that. The Greek concept of the cosmos, of nature, is very hard to translate into modern minds. It can only be done with a great deal of struggle and a lot of overturning of universally accepted definitions, because we have so reworked our picture of the world to make it fit on the Procrustean bed of a Verstand civilization and a Verstand upbringing and education. And as an artist, Phil, you're well aware of this because you struggle against this all the time, how to express these things that are excluded by that civilization and that lifestyle and that way of thinking that won't let you visualize some of what's actually true or good or important. And so the Greeks tried to center their conception of nature not on what makes us comfortable, but on what is true or good or important. What Aristotle calls the kalos, the beautiful. He often says, when he's trying to explain how to frame logic and arguments, that you must never lose track of the kalos, and that the kalos goes far beyond just whether it pleases you visually, but goes to what Heraclitus called the hidden harmony. That there is a deep organization in the cosmos that wasn't created by us, and it's constantly generating new order in ways that are harmonious, that make sense. You can imagine a lot of ways in which the universe could be organized such that it would fall apart. For example, in the modern order, we often talk about entropy as though entropy is a universal principle and that all things run down, all things decay. We've all heard this growing up, and we've heard it everywhere. We hear it in stories, we hear it in newspaper articles, we hear it in speeches. But it's not actually true. It's an assertion of a worldview. The mechanistic worldview is that somebody needs to design and construct things, and then they wear down over time until they don't work anymore, and that's the life cycle of things. And that's a deeply anti-Greek view of the world. But in that view of the world, entropy is necessary to assert as a principle or as a pseudo principle, because that's how you justify why there have to be designers and creators constantly reasserting mechanistic order through force upon a universe that would otherwise collapse under its own. If that weren't the way the universe worked, then we'd have to call into question colonization, hierarchies, armies, all kinds of things would be called into question. We have this idea that you have to force things mechanically to be the way that you want them to be, because they have no order of their own, they have no sustainment of their own, they have no regeneration of their own.
Where are you coming to Miami?
Oops, Sharon, was that you?
I think she left her mic on. She didn't realize that.
Oh, okay.
I want to go back again. I brought up Cézanne a few years ago, and I talked about those blank spaces, which most people misinterpret as like the nothingness, which projected into a future.
Mm-hmm.
And I asserted that that wasn't what it was. It was that he couldn't find the colors
Yes.
needed to
Yes.
express that. So that remained an unspeakable mystery rather than nothingness. I mean, it's like,
yes,
if you understand that of Cézanne, then in a sense, he's actually talking in a very deep way.
Yes.
I can't talk about this, right?
Yes. It's beyond me.
That's right. So that has wonderment in it in relationship to expressing that which you could point to or see.
Right.
And I think to misunderstand and project it forward to being a nothingness, it's wrong.
Yeah. I love your Cézanne story. I mean, I think it's brilliant. It really underscores a counter-modern worldview, right? The modern worldview is that the modern logical bed of Procrustes of our minds is capable of representing everything objectively, inherently, and that's our birthright. We don't actually have to work for it. We're just born into seeing the world as it really is, unlike previous eras who were all primitive and savage and subjective. But we're the true objective ones. We're angels of reason who see things the way they're supposed to be. And if there's any part of that that's not true, it can be fixed with a little education. You just, you could just train people, and once they're properly trained and educated, then they become, by fiat, by diploma, they become objective and capable of seeing all things. And the idea that that's just not only wrong, but like backwards from the truth, that it's actually very difficult to see the world as it truly is, and that there are going to be some things we can approximate okay, and there's going to be other things we can't approximate at all, where our attempt to explain them does enormous violence to what they actually are. The idea that we have to be humble in our epistemological relationship to the cosmos and constantly be aware of what we can't fit into our minds accurately. Moderns are like, don't even say that. Don't even think that. That's just gross. But the classical Greeks were like, yes, that's the default condition. We start out in this cosmos of wonders that we don't understand, that's bigger and older and more profound than we are, and we're feeling our way in the darkness to try to illuminate a little bit, but we must never lose sight of the fact that there's all these things around us that we don't understand, and they may not be inherently representable by
it's so interesting. I just read an article, Rick, that perfectly underscores that perspective. It's 40 French volunteers that lived in a cave. They had no phones or clocks. They came out and they said it was absolutely fantastic. Many of them wanted to go back into the cave. There's a synchronicity here because there's an article in the cave in this essay. But interestingly, they lost their sense of time. Inside the cave, they lost their sense of time. I'll post the article in the chat.
Oh, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting that Cézanne only did this late in his thing. Earlier on, he, of course, painted the whole picture. He was trying to struggle with the forms. It's more Kantian. And then that got me to thinking, that's what happened to Oedipus. Yes. It was when he got old that he realized there was something more, right? That he can't be certain of anything. So, I mean, that's why I kind of defended him you have to read Oedipus the Colonist to really
Yes.
understand the full story.
Yes.
Because it's almost as if we should be born when we're 60 years old. Instead of, because then we go begin in a way. Well, actually, children are much more that way. So
Yeah.
I'll take that back. About 60 years old.
Yeah. Thanks, Phil. Marianne, then Richard.
So when I read about to see what is true and not just what is known, I was trying to challenge myself, because I think that Descartes' mechanical universe is really our mythos of our age, and that we really live in a quantum world, and the space-time continuum is real, and we just have to figure out how to visualize it. And I like what Bill was saying about silence and finding the colors. I really think that we have to overreach our brains right now into this quantum reality, because we are all connected and one, and we have to restore that sense of mystery again. And that's one way of doing it. So I'm trying to stretch myself.
Yeah, this idea that some things can't be represented is a really good one to bring close to the heart. There's a look that old films have that new films don't have. And there's more than one look. There's different, because they use different technologies to do filming in different eras. There's a film that, unless you're a serious horror fan, you should never watch, because it's brutal. It's just deeply brutal. But it's beautiful, and it illustrates this at a profound level. It's a film called Suspiria. It's Italian horror from the 70s. They used to call the director Dario Argento the Italian Hitchcock, and he did this really brutal murder film, in which it was filmed in places with gorgeous architecture and all kinds of color, just intensely saturated color. He was trying to make a dream movie instead of a linear movie. And so the plot doesn't actually make sense when you study it closely, and neither do the characters. But the sounds and the sights are hypnotic and overwhelming. Well, it turns out it was the last film shot in Europe using a 3-color strip process. His cameras ran 3 separate films through for the 3 colors, and he got all deeply saturated blues, deeply saturated greens, deeply saturated reds, and when he put them together, he got a film that has colors that you can't actually film anymore. It's just like, it was very expensive. Part of what the modern era has been doing is getting more efficient about extracting profit from things, and that often involves reduction in quality, although it doesn't want to admit that. But this is one of the classic examples where just that, after he was done with that film, the company took back the camera and the film, and that they were retiring the process because it was just too expensive, and that was the last film shot on it. And when you look at it, it's safe to watch a certain segment near the beginning where a young woman has arrived in Europe to go to a dance school, and she gets into a taxi cab, and it's driving through the rain, and as it drives, all of these lights are going by outside the window, like happens at night, where the lights go by on reflecting on the windows and on the people inside, but it's colored lights. So all these deep saturated colors are passing over the face through the rain-soaked windows, and it's to beautiful music at that point. It's just like dream music, like a music box with a dancer in it, is kind of the metaphor he's going for. And just, you can find that if you Google it, that opening sequence of her driving in the cab, and if you watch only that and nothing else, you'll see what I mean about the way nobody can film that anymore. It's unrepresentable now. We've eliminated the technology, and that's sort of a metaphor for the concept that whatever we're using to do the representation itself imposes limits, even when it's just our own thinking and our way of visualizing the world. And as a result, there are enormous parts of the world that we can't represent at all accurately, or worse, that we can only represent in a deeply caricatured way that we then mistake for reality and say, well, this must be accurate because this is what my brain is producing. And that's when we become trapped. We stop being existentialists and start being escapists, to use Kenneth Smith's terminology. We unroot ourselves and try to live in the imaginary world of our conception of the world, and that's just not sustainable. It can't actually be done that way.
Can you put that in the chat, the name of that, and I'll look it up?
Sure. I'll do that. Richard, go ahead.
Like Kenneth talks about like, kind of like left-brained and, kind of our logos dominated thinking. And I read this article like talking about like kind of savants and, some creative like abilities that get expressed, sometimes often either like in dementia, like where the left side of the brain like becomes diminished or damaged, or like due to like sudden brain image or brain damage. And like I'll just kind of quote from this article. It's like, in general, the right side is home to creativity and the left is the center of logic and language. But the left side is also something of a bully. It tends to be the dominant brain region. It tends to suppress very marginal types of thinking, highly original, highly creative thinking, because it's beneficial for our decision-making abilities and our ability to function in normal life. And the theory goes that as patients' left hemispheres became progressively more damaged, the right hemispheres were free to flourish. And so they find this in like, in cases of brain damage, but also like in experiments where they use like magnetic instruments to like temporarily like reduce the activity in the left brain center. And they're able to like get like the like phenomenologically the study patients like experience like a difference in their thinking creatively.
That's very interesting. I would like to look at that if you ever find the
yeah, I'll paste it here,
because that's very interesting. I struggle with Kenneth Smith around the left brain, right brain stuff, because in the mid 20th century we took it all extremely literally, and we've since learned that it's far more complicated than that. But we've also learned that even though it's more complicated than that, it doesn't follow that it's not exactly true. It's got some truth to it, but it's a more complicated, nuanced truth that's harder to put into words.
Right. You mean like some of the kind of the misconceptions that like we only use one side of our brain, or that we're only using like 10% of our brain, and like, those kind of weird.
Still helpful as a myth, though, even though there's a kernel of untruth. The myth is still useful, right?
Well, and this is why it's useful then to be able to tie it to studies showing that actually there's still some foundational truth in it, even though it requires nuance to express it fully.
He doesn't mention that in this essay, but I think the next essay he talks about kind of left brain thinking, like when I was doing a search.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Donald, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, he always referred to me as reptilian, not as left brain or right brain. Kenneth does have a lot of these strange things about the left brain, right brain. I guess I'm not very creative, so I always but we think about this Apollonian Dionysian duality. But I think you have to keep always in mind that there was an integration of these things in Greek culture, that we say, oh, that Apollonian logicism, whatever. But the priestess at Delphi, that's to Apollo. She's the spokesman of Apollo. She's the one that says, know thyself. There's great deal comes out of this. So don't turn this into an animosity, I think, or a warring between these sides. The idea is more to integrate them, understand the limitations and where they are. And I was going to say something else, but I think my dementia is taking over. No, I want to say to Phil, that scene he referenced, I think they're waiting to see the sorrow and the pity, which I actually went out and bought. The Woody,
the Woody Allen.
From the Woody Allen stuff. In fact, I think the sorrow and the pity appears on marquees in multiple Woody Allen movies, but I think that's what they're waiting to see there, which is a kind of I think it's a very good movie. I don't have like 4 hours to go watch it very frequently, but it's pretty good.
The sorrow
It's
and the
about,
pity?
huh?
The sorrow and the pity?
The sorrow and the pity. Phil might know, but it's a war about France after the end of World War II, and the sort of who were the real traitors, who were the real patriots, you know, to love your country. Was it to work with the Germans or to oppose them? Sort of. It's kind of morally tries to do it. I think morally, of course, it's been years since I've watched it. Anyway, I think that's enough for now.
Well, that's good stuff. You know, and I always have to resist the temptation to follow up on things like pity, because for the Greeks, it was so pivotally important. They had special terms for it and a whole cosmology of ethics based on the concept of pity. And they thought that people who were unmoved by pity weren't human. If you know, anyone who tried to make themselves so tough that they would just do the right thing no matter what and wouldn't respond to pity, the Greeks thought they were incapable of justice, and without justice they weren't human. They were just you know, beasts. A lot of the thing when the US government says US government never apologizes for this, the US military never apologizes for that, whenever we say those things, I always think of the classical Greek response, which would be, well, then you're not human, you're less than human, because everything, all of civilization begins with being moved by other people, and it makes everything possible. So that's some potent stuff there. But I want to underscore your key point too, Donald, which is that it's tricky with when you're reading Kenneth Smith, because he's constantly trying to fit thousands of years of philosophy into individual sentences. And so he's always looking for this. This is the poetry problem. He's always looking for this problem. How do you condense and condense and condense? And how do you do these references such that they evoke entire books or series of books or arguments among philosophers? And so he'll throw out terms like left brain and right brain, or Apollonian, Dionysian, and reptilian, and so forth. And he doesn't mean any of them literally. Every one of them is a hook. So if he says Apollonian, Dionysian, he's talking about the whole history of the struggle between logos culture and mythos culture, between gnosis and noesis, Verstand and Begriff. He's talking about Nietzsche, who made Apollonian Dionysian his centerpiece. He's talking about, you know, and because he's summoning Nietzsche in Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, right, is arguing that philosophy and drama both arose out of the worship of Dionysus, that it was the acknowledgement of the limitations of the rational mind and the importance of attending to the deeper things that can't be expressed rationally that led to the exploration, the philosophical explorations of those deeper things, and also the attempt to teach them through myth and through theater, which began with tragedy for them. So there's this whole, you know, constellation of stuff that he's summoning in anytime he says the word Dionysian, and he means all of it. That's part of what's so tricky about you know, reading Kenneth Smith. Is, you know, how do you get started? And the answer is, well, it's hard. It's hard to get started. Right? You're constantly being confronted by these individual words that mean entire, you know, histories.
I think Kenneth would say it somewhat like Hegel. Just pick a book and keep reading until you've read them all. It's a system. You'll it once you've got the whole thing, it will in fact show you its beginning, how it began, and justify its current existence.
Yes.
And I think there's still a book or two missing from Kenneth's.
Well, he's got about 12 of them in various states of preparation.
He's had them. He's had.
I'm working on it.
I sometimes think. I was talking to Angela one time, and I said, I've got gigabytes of stuff from Kenneth over the years, and she just shook her head and said, like, don't we all?
Right. Right. Yeah, if you see his house or even a picture of his house from the inside with the bookshelves on all the walls, bookshelves extending into the space in the rooms so that it becomes like a labyrinth you have to navigate to get anywhere. And you sort of that full to bursting, way too much to express or store or even be able to inhabit peacefully with. It's just sort of the recurring theme. And so, but you're right. It means one of the core things about Kenneth's argument, about his own arguments, is that nobody can understand them the first time. They certainly aren't going to, but they also aren't going to fully understand it the second time either. That these are things you have to recapitulate, and that when you come back to them after having read more stuff, you'll read the same sentence differently, and sometimes very differently than the way you read it the first time. I know in Otherwise, there are parables I loved the first time I read them, and other parables that just fell flat for me. And some of the ones that fell flat for me the first time that I just was not interested in all, some of those are now my favorites because I finally understand what he's saying. And I'm like, oh my God, that's so important. Somebody
Yeah.
needed to say that. But I was not in a position to be able to even think that idea, let alone evaluate whether I liked it or not.
I think you're supposed to practice by reading Calvino or something to get warmed up to reading that one, where he sort of stylistically copies Invisible Cities.
Yes.
And that's Phil would like that. Invisible Cities is a book of what's not said.
Oh yeah. Have you read Invisible Cities, Phil?
No, I haven't.
Oh, Calvino.
I'm not much of a reader.
Well, yes, it's
yes, very mythic.
yeah.
You'll so he refers to it off and on,
Okay.
because it's such an example.
I wrote that down. So
okay, so I think we had a line. I think it was Phil, then Sharon, then Joseph.
Yeah.
Can you turn my video back on, please?
Oh, I think you have to do it. There you go.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yay.
I wanted to say many things, but I think I'll say what I originally wanted to say, was that I wondered whether that wasn't a trade-off that was necessary when you develop a complex society or even a simple society, because it seems to me you not only have to live in this sort of very diverse and mysterious world, but you also have this function of efficiency is also what's important as well if you're going to operate within the city. I think Hammurabi said this, the Babylonian king. When somebody asked him like about civilization, couldn't we just have the good stuff and leave out the bad stuff? And he said, unfortunately, you can't. You have to take both sides of the coin, right? And so in a sense, we are trapped in the city because we have developed this technical mind that allow us to build tools of efficiency on all levels. And it seems to me, when you look at children's art, they're quite expressive. Now, you could partly say, well, that's because they don't have the hand-eye coordinations well, and that might be true to a certain degree. But it's very interesting when they get older, about before they're teens, let's say the 8 or 9 or 10, they really want to draw very realistically as much as they could. And the expressionistic part, the inner emotional part sort of kind of goes away. The exploration part kind of goes away because they have to, in a sense, they gotten old enough that they realize they have to live in society and function and represent things, okay? And then a few escape that, but mostly then later on, maybe a few would escape that and realize, that's very limiting. But most would continue this sort of representational mode. And I just think that that's such a pressure in society that we have to learn the system in order to function in it, and otherwise we just kind of get left behind, as you say. So therefore, you almost have to develop into being followers on some level, right? You follow the system, you follow your leader, you follow whatever, because if you don't, you're gonna get court-martial or whatever. So I kind of think that is part of the problem, that it's hard to change people, because once they become a follower of some system, they're stuck to that, because it's just such an important part of what it is to function within a structure that necessitates that. So I think breaking out of it becomes a very difficult thing. You either have to live in a family or live in a system that allows more of that, or else you have to somehow at some point recognize that, no, wait a minute, this is just not right.
Yeah.
And then once you realize that, now I was always fortunate, and some people are surprised when I say that, I was very lucky that I was very poor when I was young. So I never needed very much money. Of course, I realized I needed some money. Okay. And so because of that, I was always frugal. I didn't need very much stuff. So therefore, in a sense, I could reject the capitalist system as much as I could within reason. I mean, you can't reject it all. Otherwise, you're nowhere. So in that sense, but once you then particularly fall into the system in which, money as power and all that kind of stuff, then in a sense, you follow that train and always takes you to a destination. I remember when I came to this country, I was very bad at reading, because partly is learning English, right? So I had a lot of English development courses, even when I was in grade school. And one teacher said to me, when you read something, what you got to do is read the first paragraph or thereabouts and identify the topic sentence, right? Then what you do is you go to the end, skip the middle, go to the end and find the conclusion, right? And then that will give you a narrative to string yourself along. I always rejected that. That's probably one of the reasons why I'm not a very good reader, because it's just confusing, right? Because it's confusing when you don't follow the road, because you're all over the place, and then it took so much time to kind of pile it together to construct another alternative. So I kind of think that, efficiency, it's just such an important thing to our lives that in a sense, most people fall into it. Not because oh, wow, that's really, really good. It's just if you don't, just watch out. It's not going to be good.
Yeah, that's right. We talked about this maybe a month ago when we were talking about checklists that are used by airplane pilots and in medicine, and how you can prevent an enormous number of mistakes by using checklists. They're an incredibly valuable tool. They're so valuable that all complex, sophisticated systems eventually need to do checklists, or else they're not going to make it. The problem only comes when that becomes not the floor, but the ceiling. And we start saying it now, nobody can innovate, nobody can explore, which is a temptation. It's easy to slip into, especially if you put people under pressures that create perverse incentives, so that they are cutting corners and they're like, well, the one corner I'm not going to cut is my checklist. So I'll cut all the creativity out of it, and I'll just go by the numbers, and then nobody can fire me because I did my job. So there's all these ways in which we can slip into the systematized thinking in ways in which, instead of it serving us, we start serving it. Or as Kenneth likes to say, we become symptoms of it rather than being fully realized human beings. And so there's this balancing act, like what Donald said earlier. What Kenneth's after is not that one or the other of these is right and that should be our master and the war ends that way, hooray, the end. but rather that we have this struggle to reconcile them both because we need both sets of capabilities in order to be whole human beings. And that's whereas the kind of artist that you are, Phil, you have an advantage over the average person because you're constantly standing at that gateway looking out into the inexpressible going, I think that's important too. And I'm going to be thinking about that a lot. A lot of people carefully arrange their lives to make sure that not only don't they think about those things, they try not to think about the possibility that there could be such things. They try to stay within the frame in a way that makes them think there's no frame and that they're seeing everything and that it's complete. And that's the trap. When we start collaborating in the construction of the labyrinth that encloses us. Rather than
not only that, I mean, not only do you exclude the mysteries in a way,
yeah,
but you also exclude to a certain degree what's just in front of your eyes.
Yeah.
Having taught beginning drawing a lot, one of the things you have to teach them is when you're drawing something, a lot of times you have to forget about the name of the thing you're drawing.
Yes.
Because you will draw the concept rather than what you actually see.
Right.
And that some way is a hard lesson to break from them, because once they realize, when I look at it now, it is different. I'm drawing the image that's already in my mind rather than the image actually in front of me. So
right, it's such a temptation. Sharon, then Joseph, then Dave. Go ahead, Sharon.
Well, I just wanted my video back on. That's
okay.
it.
So we're covered.
Yes.
Joseph, then Dave.
Yeah, no, I find that the idea of efficiency to be very interesting and important when you're talking about efficiency versus the idea of effectiveness, because there are two very big different concepts. And efficiency is just looking at time, money, and effort, and the level of effort that is going into it, whereas effectiveness is actually looking at what the outcome is, the desired outcome.
Right.
And that's a really important distinction, because the example that Phil just provided was excellent. It's the idea of time. Read the first, find the sentence. Yes. And then read the conclusion and then come to something.
Mm-hmm.
But if you read the whole thing, you come to an understanding and you really understand what is being said in the paper. So, but the important distinction in that process is that your values change.
Right.
And what happens is your values get perverted. And so then the system, you can't really manage yourself towards an ideal anymore, because you've just taken what you've learned as far as just coming to a conclusion, and now you're managing yourself towards a conclusion versus actually managing yourself towards understanding or what the ideal outcome would be. And it's something that exists. Is that the real question then becomes, is that what degree of efficiency do we really need in order to exist? Because you want to minimize that in that process, because there is a certain degree that's absolutely, and the idea of checklists was a good example as well. And the ceiling example is perfect, because then how do you break through that ceiling? But to what level do you need to be efficient? And then how do you balance that? And I always looked at this like an energy equation of some sort, where you're looking to just balance efficiency and effectiveness, and you really want it to be effectiveness. But I don't know how you get to that right balance. I really don't. It becomes a very challenging question on a societal level. But It's an interesting one. It's interesting when you're talking about it becomes also convoluted in times, like if you're putting artificial constructs like money into it, adding it into the equation, where then things get inflated, and that perverts the system itself too, because you really don't know how to determine value, because you're flooding it with this false form of exchange. So it's an interesting question.
Yeah, metrics are tricky because they can be so useful, but if you turn them into incentives, they could be so destructive.
Yes.
It's like,
right.
it's how do you get them involved in the process in a way that people don't start chasing them?
Exactly. And then they
Min-maxing.
become the system, like
And
the
so
metrics, and that's pervert.
That's precisely where myth comes into play, I think. That's
exactly.
where myth
That's exactly.
being the moral component, the morality, not just that we can do something, but should we do it? Do we need next day delivery? How about if it costs, 1 million lives a year, whatever the number is, that type of thinking. So that's where myth is so important as the counterbalance. And that's where money, as you point out, can be so damaging, because in abstracting that away, you commodify the myth and to a certain extent where it has no impact anymore. Or it could be used, as you point out, perversely. And you could, so you're seeing that with, for example, in the real world, you're seeing that with carbon credits. Here is something that's supposed to ostensibly lower the limit of emissions in the atmosphere. It's having just the reverse impact because of how it's distributed and because of the putting this value where it shouldn't exist. We need to make a moral judgment that the environment is not worth destroying, regardless of any economic value that we could extract from that. And that's what's missing. And that's, I think, what I wanted to draw our attention to on page 35. We're sort of skirting around this. He says that soul can never be utterly in schism with itself, a very Smithian concept in my limited understanding, and that the knock on rationality is that it's analytical, it's divisive, it's a distinction monger. And so any metric will necessarily be analytical and divisive. It will take us into schism with ourselves. It will be without soul by definition.
Yes.
Thank
yes.
you for saying that. Yeah, because that really does, call out the power of myth and the importance of myth within, because if you have these metrics and you only use a rationalist approach to them, then what is, your truth is completely perverted, and you can come to any kind of conclusion that, that you essentially want. And that's what we've seen, especially over the 20th century. So thank you.
Dave, just like on that, I'm assuming you're referring to the ProPublica investigation on carbon credits and some of the fallout thereafter.
Yeah, that's an example of it, isn't it?
That's such an example of basically our systematizing, our economic, these abstractions that basically have just completely run off the rails.
Yeah.
Tesla makes more money trading carbon credits than they do selling their automobiles.
Oh,
so
God.
Here's a corporation that is ostensibly very green and pro-environment, and really they're just involved in financial engineering.
Oh, God help us. On that note, Sharon and then Marianne, go ahead.
So I'm watching a series now called Markets and Morals. And the question of efficiency and effectiveness is being discussed quite a bit. For example, wouldn't the transplant system, the medical transplantation system, be efficient if we had a market for kidneys? Why can't you sell your kidneys?
Oh, God.
What's wrong with that? Right? And so the point I was going to make about effectiveness and efficiency, because I do like metrics. In fact, I live by metrics to gauge a system. Mm-hmm. But within that system, you have to have a certain value.
Yes.
And that value is probably your myth that drives that system, whatever it is. But for a system to be efficient, it has to have a set of metrics. But undergirding that metrics has got to be a value system, whatever you determine that it is.
Yes. I agree completely. And I'm going to go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, can I just say something to that? But it's when the metrics become dogma. That's right. It's as a measurement, they're fine. But when they become the only thing that we're measuring ourselves towards, and then that does show the power of myth in there. It really calls it out nicely.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So like with everything, I think everything is also, for me, is balance, equilibrium, and recalibrating. Always.
Yes. It's why the metaphor for the third form of mentality, the eristic form of mentality, is not an easy one. You know, it's always working. It's always pushing the boulder up the hill, never stopping pushing the boulder up the hill. It's the attractiveness of the dualic / begriff mindset versus the Banausic / Verstand mindset, is that each of them seems to offer a state that you can enter and then just exist in, and then your life will make sense and you'll just be able to live that way. And in both cases, it's false. Because they're incomplete and they both lead you into different kinds of hazards. But the promise that the Vernunft / heuristic way of life offers is the promise that most people don't want. You'll be able to work hard for the rest of your life, always struggling to figure out and balance right and wrong and what's true and false and how to do things, that there's not going to be any easy answers. But at least you'll be able to avoid the caricatured idiocies of the other two mindsets, which are so easy to describe and see how they lead us awry. You'll be making newer and more interesting mistakes. It's sort of the promise of being an Aristos. And you can see why a lot of people are like, well, that guy's promising me an easy life and I'll know what the answers are. So of course I'm going to go with that. Why would I go with you? I don't want to push a boulder up the hill for the rest of my life. But it's inescapable that we're all constantly struggling with our metrics. Who's to be the master? Are they going to master us, or are we going to master them? Are they going to serve us, or are we going to become symptoms of them? And the only way to avoid becoming a symptom of your metrics is to, as Sharon says, you've got to value saturate your situations and make sure that it's impossible to forget to put the patient first, because you're constantly saying it. It's on the posters all around you. The people around you are saying it. It's got to be everywhere at all times. Patient first, patient first, patient first. So that no matter how deep you get into the calculations with the metrics, it's just not possible to accidentally shove the importance of the patient into the background. And, if you go into a VA hospital and you ride the elevators, slapped up on the walls on the elevators, there's stuff all around about putting the patient first. It's like everywhere you look. And it's because if you're going to be that metric driven, you also have to be that value driven to avoid catastrophes. Marianne, then Donald.
I agree with what you're saying here, but I wanted to throw something else out there. So I've been trying to walk during the pandemic. And at first, like, I'll do 10,000 steps. But then I decided to try to do walking meditation. And in walking slow, I feel like I'm really there. And this compulsion to think tick-tock, I had to get out of the compulsion of thinking of time, like power walking. And I see people all around power walking. And I'm using this walking meditation so I can actually be there and get in touch with myself and enjoy the moment. And I try to pretend that I'm one with the earth. And, I do this kind of thing where I have a wide angle eye as opposed to just focused on a screen. So it's really pleasurable and define what the matrix of the past was for me. So efficiency is not always pleasurable.
Yeah. Yeah. Ain't that the truth? That's you walk the way that my friend Jerry and I like to go hiking. We say, well, we're going to go to Cascade Pass and maybe we'll make it up to the top, but we don't really care if we do or don't. What we really care about is that we're there. We're in the place, walking around, being there instead of programming or sitting at a computer or getting in a meeting, that we want to be fully present so that we can soak in and be transformed as much as possible by the experience. And if we spend the whole time, caught up in an argument or listening to Walkmans or something, then we might as well have stayed home. What's the point of efficiently zipping to the top and back and not really being there and experiencing it and escaping that that trap of the mind. So
so that's a variation of efficiency. I hate to interrupt here, but
Yes.
walking meditation just doesn't do it for me. If I'm going to walk, I'm going to get cardio, going to exercise. When I want to meditate, I have a seat.
yes,
So I can't commingle those things.
Yes.
Right. So it's just where, again, reevaluating. Where's your efficiency? What's your metric? It's that same thing.
Yeah. There's this interesting thing about hiking, about the fact that the trails are not at all like it is in the city. They're not smooth, they're not flat, they're not straight. And so, there's roots everywhere, there's rocks everywhere. Some of the surfaces are at different angles. Some of them you'll slip on. And so you have this weird experience where you got to keep half your vision on the ground so that you don't fall over. That you don't have when you're walking around Green Lake or in a park, where things are more straightforward and settled. And so there is a certain level to which you can't disengage yourself entirely from a hike while you're hiking, because otherwise you fall over. It's like the first route that comes along and you're down. Let's see, I think Richard and then Phil.
It's so much, just one thing, it's so much better for your feet, because you're not only working just the one sense, we're working so many different senses at the same time.
Yeah, all the little muscles have to be engaged, constantly adjusting with every single step, because
it's not only the muscles but the senses too. You're using all your 7 senses. So
yes,
I apologize for
that's quite all right. Richard and then Phil. Go ahead, Richard.
Are most people familiar with the what's referred to as the Cobra Effect in economics, in reference to metrics and Cobra?
Remind us.
Okay. If most people have heard this and I wasn't okay, but I think maybe this is valuable. So, like what we're talking about here, like metrics and dogma and like efficiency versus effectiveness. So, or like kind of like like I'll try to like distinguish between like the problem arises when metrics become targets, and then this gets then tied to incentives. So actually not just bonuses, but promotions, and then kind of in our society today, like like those who don't get promoted, or get like satisfactory ratings, they get called, like your livelihood, like, so it creates these like these perverse incentives, and sometimes it can be ratchet or worse, but like just so the idea of the Cobra Effect is it's a story that arises out of like colonial India, where I think it's like neither New Delhi, let's say New Delhi, that they're having a problem with cobras. I think the same story is also like with like say like rats, say like in Vietnam, like with under French imperialism. And so the idea is like they give rewards for basically bringing back a dead cobra, or in the case of rats, like, like, okay, cut the tail off and bring back like rat tails. And then, and like this campaign is really effective, like they give out all this money, and then, someday they find but then soon along in this process, they go out into the forest and the woods or whatever, and they find that these people are basically farming and raising, cobras and rats to generate.
I had not heard this.
Okay, you've not heard this. Okay, but I mean, like, okay, like once you remember that, it's very unforgettable. And the thing is, like, we might kind of like look down on, oh yeah, these are like these backwards, like third world people, whatever. But you find examples of this, like
we
in
do the
our
same
world.
thing.
Okay, so Rick, you're in Seattle, right? So Seattle during its kind of its rough days, it's kind of its gold rush days. Right. I mean, like they had a problem with like too many bodies, like were on the street, and they weren't really, like the coroner couldn't keep up with like claiming, with like, collecting and claiming them. Yes. So they started offering rewards for bringing in bodies.
Yes.
And so gangs would start killing people and bringing them in. And then they found like, okay, no, that's not what we wanted. So like, any obvious evidence of foul play, we will not, like issue the reward. Yes. And so they would then basically incapacitate the person and then tie them to the piers at low tide.
Yes.
And then wait for the tide to come in and then bring the body in. And like to break, so So sort of the less sensationalist versions of this are, like a good arts law. That's the name of an economist. So like once a metric becomes a target, it basically becomes useless as a metric, because it gets distorted. I mean, like they find this actually even with like AI, and that like they find that they're optimizing for a problem, but then the metrics that they're issuing to like the machine learning, like the program took a shortcut that basically, oh no, that's actually not what we want, and now it's given us something more optimal, but it's actually defeated the purpose of it. I guess you'd have to kind of exclude what Aristotle called the middle term. But this Cobra effect, like I found, like just searching, like there's even been like an updated pandemic version of this, where at BYU and Idaho, they for like blood donation, they offer like just regular at the blood donation, they offer $50 for donating plasma. But if you've had COVID and you have then they'll offer you $100 for your plasma.
No.
So they've had to issue a warning to please do not intentionally expose yourself to COVID.
Oh God.
So
just to make your blood more valuable.
Right. Yeah. So it's
yes.
Yeah, the Cobra effect. I think it's
the Cobra effect.
Well, that's going to stick. Hard to forget it.
Thank you, Richard. I don't think any of us is going to forget this one. Yes, in Seattle's lovely, terrifying early history. Yeah. All right, Phil, and then Joseph.
Yeah, I think that was a very funny story because it rings so true. So unfortunately, I was going to say something else, but it seems like it correlates with this. I think the problem is that the people who are in the power to be are in some ways too removed from the reality of the people. And I think that gap creates, in a sense, a schism of understanding. I remember back in, I guess in the 60s, it would be the 60s, to the Cultural Revolution, about that time, when Chairman Mao decided that the problem with not enough grain harvest was these damn insects, right? And so like, no, it was the birds. The birds were eating, I got that wrong. The birds were eating too much of the stuff, okay? So he actually had a national program of go out there and kill the birds, right? Because that will save the crop and so forth. And it turned out to be a famine because like when you kill the birds ate the insects, right? And the insects then are free to eat even more grain, right? That was one actually before we had this relationship with China, way before, when we were very hostile. China was forced to import a lot of American grain to China. I mean, I'm sure that is the last kind of grain they want, but nonetheless, they had to do it because, of course, Chairman Mao with the little red book, he knows everything. I mean, like, so therefore, in a sense, he was so removed from the reality of that situation that he just, I think if you asked the farmers, they would have understood this, but nonetheless, he didn't. And he was in this sort of distance, and he knew everything, and he made a command, and everybody, of course, obey. If you don't obey, then of course you go to prison because the Red Guard will get you. So I mean, so I kind of think that one of the things I sort of semi-admire about New York City when I lived there was obviously there were very, very rich people, and they ride in limousines, so you don't really see them. But beyond that, like, all sorts of people ride in the subways. They had to interact with each other as on some minimal level, okay? So it was in a way not like Los Angeles, where you could just go to your home, drive in a freeway. Back in those days, it was a little freer. And you go to your work, and then you go from your work back to home. You never meet any of those damn poor people who got in your way, right? So it really created this schism. I think that was a time when they had those freeway killers, right? It's kind of like nobody really cared about anything. So I kind of think that separation of the higher up from the regular people creates a real schism in terms of understanding each other, you know? And I think that is also part, I think that creates another level of system. In other words, it's a system built on top of a system that it really is creating a real problem.
Yeah.
And we have to fix that. I wonder whether they should, well, they must be doing it now to a certain degree. They must build neighborhoods in such a way that you're forced to interact with each other to a certain degree. Otherwise, we will always remain apart on some level. Because in some sense, it's more comfortable to be apart. You're with your people, everybody acts pretty much the same. They're within a certain structure. So I think you have to almost force it because the society is bigger than these clusters of people that are dissonant from each other. So,
thank you, Phil. Sharon, then Joseph, then Marianne.
So when a metric leads to perverse incentives, it's time to change the metric.
Yes.
That's it. And I mean, I'm very pragmatic, right? And Kenneth Smith says it here on page 33. He says, for the truth about human beings is they're not obvious. They have a depth which one can learn to read only after much time and with great difficulty. Never absolutely certain, they're ensouled, which is as much to say they're driven by obscure forces and towards ends that are utterly a matter of interpretation. Yes. So I think we can have a system, a metric-driven system, which measure effectiveness and efficiency. And because of our human nature, when we develop perverse incentives to that metric, then we change them. But the objective is always to function well.
Yeah, we find, for example, that in medical informatics, one of the best combinations is to say, well, we're going to use all these metrics, but you're not going to be promoted or rewarded or punished in any way based on the metrics. We're going to use the metrics. We're going to teach you how to use the metrics to figure out how to do a good job. And we're going to watch the job that you're doing. And we will, of course, look at these metrics, but you can't min-max the metrics and get more money. Right. That's you got to pull that out of then it becomes perverse. And then also furthermore, then it interferes with people's willingness to change the metrics when it turns out they're bad. If they're profiting off of perverse metrics, they will protect those perverse metrics, those perverse incentives, because they now, you're threatening their livelihood if you try to change it, and they're like, well, yeah, I know a certain number of patients die, but look at my income. I'm living in a mansion. It's like, it's like there's this, and even though it's funny and it seems trivial, all of modern civilization is rife with this specific problem, that yes. Most of the things that need to be changed involve perverse incentives where people are making so much money off of it now that they will fight you tooth and nail to try to keep you from fixing it because they would lose so much money. Alas.
Money, markets, and morals. We're right back there.
Yeah, we always come back there, don't we? Joseph, then Marianne, then Donald.
Yeah, it just reminds me of a saying that, that often I found that negative people say that they can't stand the way things are, but they can't stand change. And the the idea that this is not working, it's not working, but I don't want to change it. It's like I mean, it's that's when the metric becomes a dogma, and it's kind of like this is a problem. But what's really interesting to see out of this process is how the metric takes the irrational and makes it rational.
Yeah.
And that's the idea that you essentially are now your perspective on reality. This is what we do to ourselves, though, on a much bigger level. And this is the problem with rationality, is that we tend to take our version of truth, our version of the metrics, and apply it to the world. And this is that's why myth is so important, and a purely rational perspective on the world is dangerous and by itself. The other thing that I thought was that was worth mentioning is sometimes you have the metric and then you come up with the correction, and the correction could even make things worse. because
But
yeah,
you change it again.
yeah, but that's you do have to constantly reinvent. And this is where that is a really important. We talked about the idea of entropy, and this is where order and chaos really kind of come into play. Is that a certain amount of chaos? Like we definitely need a certain amount of chaos in the sense, and this is the balance that I was kind of referring to initially. But it does highlight the fact how our rationality changes very quickly, in the sense that the minute our version of the truth, whatever that is, then becomes our reality, and then this is how I think we should kill people, or in order to get paid, or whatever it may be, or kill cobras in order to get paid. It's crazy, but it shows you how fast a strictly rationalist approach can impact you.
Yeah, part of what's essentially one of the essential differences between colonizer culture and indigenous culture is that colonizer culture depends upon the concept of coercion, that you're going to coerce people into serving you and into being resources for you. And you're going to coerce the plant. By extension, you're going to coerce the planet. You're going to make plantations instead of ecosystems. There's all these things you're going to do. We're going to try to force an outcome. But what we see when we study systems theory is that the more you raise the stakes to try to force an outcome, the harder it is to correct the system when you discover that the system isn't perfect. And of course, Gödel assures us no system is perfect. So in order to make a responsive system, you have to lower the stakes for making changes to the system so that people can respond intelligently when they discover flaws in it. But instead, as being raised in colonizer culture, our instinct is to raise the stakes. Oh, people aren't obeying? Well, we'll just punish them more. And that'll make everything come out right. If I just hit them hard enough, I get the outcome I want. And it's surprising how deep that ethos is in all of us. Even people who think of themselves as peace-loving and human rights-loving, if you confront them with something they personally consider an atrocity, they will come up, at least at first, with a knee-jerk solution that involves coercion, because it's all around us. We're soaking in it all the time. Like literally everything about the civilization involves coercion. So it's the go-to response. We can't stop thinking it. It's like the serve the patient posters that are all over the VA. All around us in our culture are these things reminding us we can force the outcome. You can just make things happen if you just get the incentives right and punch people the right way. It's hard for us not to think that way. Let's see, Marianne, then Donald, then Phil, then Dave.
So I'm going back to the text, and
Yay.
On page 30, how much, I'm reading it, how much we owe to those determined myth slayers that Hippie Socrates and his fascist student. And I want to know why Socrates is considered a hippie and why his students are considered fascist.
So that's a pregnant sentence there. So Socrates was definitely, a think outside the box kind of guy. There's no question. Everybody considered him an oddball. He was sort of like a hippie in that sense, and he was questioning authority and questioning everything around him, and this is why he's calling him a hippie metaphorically. But when he died,
I don't see that.
Oh, if you do a search, you could do a search for how much we owe, and you'll find the sentence.
Okay.
So, but Plato's response to Socrates' death was a kind of rage that stuck with him for the rest of his life, that he then tried to come across as incredibly calm. But when you look at his layout of the Republic is incredibly controlling. It's like the first world systematically described dystopia. And it includes things like banning all artists, because he didn't like the artists who wrote comedies mocking Socrates. And so he said, fine, let there be no artists at all. They shouldn't exist. And when you look at the layout, you see that a lot of subsequent civilizations have used it as a blueprint for their own totalitarian ideals. So this is kind of what he means by hippie and fascist in this sense, that certainly Socrates was not promoting a systematic dogma to be imposed upon all of society, but by the same token, Plato did, in fact. And it's part of why it's hard to read Aristotle correctly unless you understand that Aristotle thinks Plato did a bad job of understanding Socrates. Aristotle is frequently making snipes at Plato, even when he doesn't name him. Like when he says it's a sign of a bad upbringing to bring too much precision to a topic more than it can bear, he's talking about Plato. He's saying Plato is being way too sure of himself and saying in defined ways things where we ought to be approaching them artistically, responsively. So there is even during Plato's lifetime, there were people pushing back, going, "Whoa, this isn't real philosophy you're doing here." The critique that some people have of Plato is that Plato wasn't Aristos. He was part of an eristic tradition. He had a lot of the right instincts, right? And his dialogues are fascinating, and his engagement with the people around him is interesting. But that he fundamentally wasn't a philosopher. He was a poet who loved a philosopher and loved philosophy. And when that philosopher was taken away from him, he then tried to step into those shoes and be what he imagined a philosopher was. But what he produced was instead more a blueprint for a perfect society and a series of dialogues designed to subtly refute every counter argument, shall we say. He was sort of following in the tradition of Parmenides and Zeno of taking up every possible viable alternative and then using logical tricks to try to make it seem like it wasn't viable. And so therefore, you should just do what he said. You could see why the medieval epoch said, that, perfect, we'll just take it. That's now going to be our whole cosmology for heaven and how the medieval world will work. We'll just take it right out of Plato and make a few little adjustments. Let's see, who's next? I think, was it Donald, Phil, Dave, James?
I thought I was up. Even more so now, because I wanted to talk about the last paragraph from 29 through the second paragraph on 30, which is exactly Kenneth's attack on Plato and Socrates.
Yes.
I've had these discussions a long, long time.
Yes.
In the tradition of reading and interpreting Plato that I was raised in as a boy, this is a very extreme view.
Yes.
And it's not, it may have been, I don't know if this seems more like Hegel in the history of philosophy or Karl Popper in the enemies of whatever. But I can read these things without heartburn. I think I understand what Kenneth is getting at, and particularly, because in Kenneth's stuff, he uses the parable of the cave over and over. His understanding of what a philosopher is often is it's either Heraclitus or it's some character from a Platonic dialogue.
That's right.
It's the storytelling by Plato it's
great.
It's great.
It's just great.
And I'll have to say that the sort of the way I was trained is you need to know who these people are.
Yes.
Plato is not presenting logical arguments.
Right.
They are not, this is not logisticism. Plato comes closer than anyone else I know to a good Kenneth Smith ad hominem argument.
Yes.
The idea is to reveal character.
Yes.
It's very Aristotelian.
Yes.
And Plato often does. That's why you have, I don't know. I always think the Lackeys, Nicias pushed into a corner where he has to say, is it the general who knows how the battle will come out, or the soothsayer? And Nicias says, why, it's the general. Yet, when Nicias led the Athenian army at Syracuse,
Yes.
they failed to make their escape from the surrounding action of the Syracusans, led by a single Spartan who knew what he was doing, on the advice of his soothsayer.
Yes.
So Nicias is largely a fraud and can teach us nothing about courage. And that's what, so the simple-minded reading.
Yes.
Charmides, you see Critias and Charmides, two relatives of Plato, but members of the 30.
Yes.
And to hear Critias especially take over the argument and then say, this is how a good state ought to be run, is, again, it's an ad hominem argument. It's showing the character.
Yes.
It's not calling people names, and
Right.
Kenneth uses that ad hominem altogether. It's saying, this man has bad character. Don't listen to what he's saying.
Yes.
And there's countless, not maybe some of the later dialogues, but there are countless early dialogues where Plato gets this just right.
Oh, yeah.
And he uses it in the same way that Kenneth does.
Yeah.
And I just find that master. So when I read Plato, I have to sit down with my historical documents, Xenophon, Thucydides, whatever.
Yeah.
Go find out, who were these people? Oh, that's another. And the Meno was a jerk, got a bunch of people killed off on the March of the 10,000. And you can go read that in the Anabasis of Xenophon.
Right.
These aren't admirable people that Socrates appears to take them seriously.
Yes.
To reveal that they are not serious men.
That's right. That's right.
So while I can take this, I often wonder, it's perfectly in line with a very strong tradition of how to read Plato.
Yes.
I'll have to say that when I was in school, they said, this is not the way you read Plato.
Yes.
And I'll have to say about the Republic, that the Republic to me is more a document on how you construct a ruler, not a ruler that rules, but a measuring stick that says, how can we judge the justice of our political system?
Right.
And why do political systems fail?
Right.
Well, it says nepotism.
Right.
Like later on, the Bush dynasty. Mm-hmm. But Kenneth kindly omits, the Kennedy dynasty or there are lots of other dynasties. The Pelosi dynasty is one that's current.
Right.
And
it's challenging.
But if you look in the Republic and you see, what would we have to do to get rid of nepotism?
Yes.
You have to take everybody's children away from you.
Right.
You have to do this stuff. Well, it should come then to the astute reader that we're not going to be able to eliminate a lot of the constraints.
Right.
That limit how just a society we can live in. To me, it's like, oh, well, we should have, the government should have as little power as possible.
Yes.
because the idea that we'll have aristos exercising that power, and then there's the sort of the philosopher king. Well, as it turns out, philosophers generally, they don't want to rule anybody. They're busy ruling themselves. And And there are plenty of applicants for that position anyway. They're all Banasoi and doulos that want to be king.
Yes.
So out here, I would say what we really want are philosophy, the philosopher HVAC technician, the honest man who will fix your
come in, fix your
pump
problem,
for
and go
you,
home.
because we could, you know. I used to, in school, I used to talk about the philosopher plumber. We don't need philosopher kings. What I would give for a philosopher plumber.
Okay, I'm never going to forget that you said that. That's right. We don't need philosopher kings. We need philosopher plumbers.
Well, we need, I mean, and as much as top down driven, and as he talks about the lies, everybody refers, I think, to the noble lie in the Republic.
Yeah.
But there's
Yes.
I went off on a tangent and now I can't find my circle.
Well, when you remember what it was.
No, but
it's okay. We'll still be here.
If you get the idea from what I'm saying, there is this attack, but
Yeah.
there are alternate interpretations
Yes.
of Plato,
Yes.
which are more generous. They're never completely generous. I still can't figure out what. I mean, I've read the dialogues over and over for 50 years, and I haven't got a clue as to what half of them mean. But others, I do. Oh, I was going to say, if you want a different view of Socrates, Xenophon's Memorabilia,
Yes.
or memories of Socrates. Socrates there is not half as clever. He's a good guy. He's a guy you'd want for a friend. And Xenophon kind of is too. He's more typically an Aristos.
Yes.
In that he doesn't think in sophisticated arguments or anything. He's just had ingrained in him from childhood how a member of his class in Athens would act.
Right.
And how they would be honest, courageous,
Right.
Make good judgments, know who good men are, and spends more time actually interested in how to raise horses and how to do farming and whatever, you know. Well, anyway, that's enough. I was going to say on the subject of metrics, this perversion. I was in software too.
Yes.
Eaten up by metrics and a desire to turn it from creative writing to an engineering discipline.
Right.
Which is very hard, but some of the stuff I did get to read years and years ago was Edwards Deming, who says who said there is no substitute really for every member of an organization understanding its end.
Yes.
And acting in accordance with that end.
So Greek.
And there is nothing else you need to do. You do not need rules as to how they are to bend this metal or tighten this screw.
They'll figure it out.
Do what else?
If they're committed to the end, they'll figure it out.
Yeah. They need to see the telos.
Yes.
It's a long time since I've heard about Edward Deming. It's a long time since I've heard that name mentioned.
Well, in most organizations, in fact, all of the ones I worked in, the idea was like, I worked at my last job was for General Dynamics. I am a member of the military industrial complex.
Okay.
But we never competed against Lockheed Martin. We always, due to our ranking every year, competed against other employees. So we had little energy for dealing with other competing corporations, or in that matter, for competing with actual enemies of the United States. I don't know if I would trust us to do that or not, because I only wanted to make sure that I was better than the guy in the next cube, because otherwise, because that's what I'm judged on.
Well, that's a hotbed of innovation, then, isn't it?
Yeah.
A hotbed of innovation. I don't know.
Well, can I just say something before you ask everybody else? Because I'm listening to Donald talk, and the front of the sentence says, I found in this whole thing that Kenneth Smith says, in any given system of rational concepts, what is ultimately most interesting are the ways it hides its incoherences, bears its dogmas, like lurid pudenda behind elegant robes. That made me laugh.
Yes.
How much obliquity and innuendo there are in the examined life of Socrates, how much contraband of myth must be secreted away, spirited past the border guards. I think that's what you were saying, Donald.
Sharon, I was just about to read that sentence because it gets to the question of metrics again.
Yes.
You know, when you say if the metrics don't work, let's just change the metrics. That's just the system of rationality hiding its own inconsistency. And instead of saying, wait a minute, maybe there's something we can't measure. You know, how do you measure love? How do you measure connection? How do you measure community? How much does it weigh? Those types of things. Instead of asking those questions, it simply hides those inconsistencies and incoherencies and just says, let's change the metrics or develop a finer gradient. Let's atomize even more. Let's do more of what we're doing already. Let's not change anything. Let's preserve the status quo. So be careful.
Well, Dave, that's a mouthful. How do you measure love? Love is an action. It's very measurable, I think. Right? It's a feeling, but it's more of an action. So I think, again, I'm big on metrics, but you got to use them wisely.
Yeah, they have to be in service rather than us being
The other way around.
Yes.
What wisely is the philosophical term in that sentence, Sharon?
What unit of measurement? What unit of measurement are you using when it comes to love?
Oh, how thoughtful are you? How kind are you?
Oh, that's not a meter or a gram, is it? Right?
No, it's not a meter, but it's not. When I'm coming home late.
Oh no.
What's that?
It's how many heart. Sorry, it's how many heart emojis you put after your text. That's how you measure it.
I love you 4 hearts. I'm gonna go to the line we've got waiting, but thank you. That was brilliant. James, then Phil.
Oh yeah, thanks. Hi, you ready?
Hi, James.
Yeah, you know, if Socrates had, you know, like taking some cannabis or some acid, and he would probably be, you know, qualify as a hippie. But instead, he took the you know, hemlock, and is that the highest form of wisdom? You know, that he can attain by siding with the state and taking the hemlock and going to, you know, leaving this world. I mean, you know.
You know, the Greeks actually used mood-altering drugs all the time. They just did them in their sacred rituals, which they were then forbidden to talk about. And so we're left in this situation where we can see references to, like Heraclitus talks about the sacred kykion, barley. There's some kind of entheogen or hallucinogen they took as part of the rites of Demeter, but they didn't just go home and chuck it back to have a good time. It was only in the context, once the ritual had been set up and the stories were being told and the music was playing, then you took it to help you to visualize Demeter and your role in the web of life and the circle of life and all that. So for all we know, hippie might be an appropriate description of Socrates. It was just a part of his life that Plato and Socrates didn't, you know, put into words much for us.
And also there's some, there has been recently been some more commendable interpretations of Plato.
Yes.
French philosopher named Alain Badiou, right? And he rewrote the Platonic dialogues in the modern language.
Oh, now I'm interested. I'm curious.
And he, it's a rewriting of Plato's Republic, I think, and
if you could post the name in the chat.
And it's he interprets Plato as saying that the Republic is really a model of democracy, and that the philosopher king is representing a kind of a democracy where the guardians of that democracy, of that hierarchical structure, are also philosophers. So that's interesting. So there's your plumber philosopher, right?
Yeah, exactly. But it's part of what's challenging reading Kenneth Smith talking about Plato is that, he's talking about them as an aside while making other points. And so as a result, all we get is those sort of quick drop references, the caricatures that don't do justice to even to Kenneth Smith's own position.
Sure.
And core to Kenneth Smith's position is that, Plato was an Aristos. And as an Aristos, an enormous amount of what we think of as the good philosophical stuff is present in Plato. He was observant, he was careful and diligent. He attended to the people who mattered. He made these fantastic arguments. He helped to make sure Socrates wasn't forgotten. He did all this stuff without which we basically wouldn't have subsequent philosophy in Europe. He's a cornerstone. And his mistakes, the things he got wrong, are most interesting after you take all that for granted. Once you start with the position that he's got all this incredible value, then his errors become more interesting. But if all we do is point out the errors and we don't start by establishing the framework of, oh my God, look at all this great stuff, then we're going to be inclined to dismiss somebody who's undismissible, who's central.
It's similar to his critique of Kant in his previous paper, right?
It is. Right. We needed Kant, or we needed somebody to do what Kant did. That position needed to be staked out brilliantly, and Kant did a fantastic job. So, criticizing or critiquing Kant is not done in the modernist way where you attempt to say, so there, I win, go away. He's like, no, he's trying to put Kant and Plato into context with a pantheon of other philosophers, so that neither of them is allowed to rule or be the one and only, in a monotheistic way, but instead they have to be participants in a polytheistic, polyperspectival dialogue.
And it's the subsequent fetishism of reason that comes stemming from both of them, and what they enabled. They sort of enabled that fetishism to exist logically, right?
Yeah.
So perverting their systems enabled that fetishism of reason, which is where we then become hyperlogos and undervalue myth and all of that.
Exactly.
Kant was also a precursor of, you could say, of Freud, where he created this structure where the reason, resides in the individual mind, each mind, and that it creates its own. It participates in creating its own superego, right?
Right.
And there is the unconscious, which he calls the noumena, which you don't know anything about, but you have to, unless you can interpret your dreams and so forth. But the self is also, part of that noumena, right? The self comes out of that noumena, and so the category of imperatives are the superego that the self, the rational part of the self becomes the part of the desire, to create that superego.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it looks just like Freud, precursor of Freud.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting when we start to trace these connections, because frequently as new philosophers or writers take up, new vocabulary, it can obscure the fact that they're basically talking about almost the same thing as a previous philosopher and just putting their own little twist on it. Right. So, in Hegel argues relentlessly against Kant, and yet many of the terms he's using are Kant's terms, which is really this is similar to how Smith is criticizing Plato by saying, yeah, we needed Plato to go first and lay out all this stuff for us. I mean, Socrates didn't write anything. If it had been left up to Socrates, we'd have lost every last thing that he said. It'd have all just been vanished into the air from people saying things. But Plato wrote it down, and he was careful to capture it all and help to give us this portrait of the philosopher as a type of person that for thousands of years other people have read these descriptions, said, oh my God, I'm fired up. Now I've got the bug. I want to be a philosopher. So, we owe an enormous debt to Plato, even when we criticize him. He's still one of our culture heroes. He has to be. Phil, you're next, and then I think I will finally turn to what Sharon brought up an hour ago, which is, could I talk about principles? So
Yes.
we'll come back to that.
I'll start with just a brief defense of Plato, because I want to move to my main point. I mean, historically, there's always been a close relationship between literature or storytelling and philosophy. It's only recently that we've downgraded literature so much that we no longer see that connection. I mean, if you look at Shakespeare, you look at Dostoevsky, all those people. I mean, there's really a lot of philosophy hidden underneath it. So that's all. So I'll say one more thing about Socrates. Maybe Socrates shouldn't have a disciple to write him down, because he was reflecting the invisible mystery that it should always be in. Now, unfortunately, that means there's actually beyond philosophy. Okay, now I'll get to my main point. I mean, we've identified in a way that is our humanity, which is really the problem more than nature itself. And I have to retell this story. Most of you probably heard it. When I was at Penn State, I was living with a philosophy graduate student as my roommate. And one day I came home and I said, I found the missing link. And of course, he was curious because everybody wanted to know what the missing link was. And after we sat down, I said, the missing link is really mankind. The thing with mankind is we are actually two species. There is simply mankind, you're born into it, you're part of mankind, no matter who you are. But human beings are a special kind of mankind because they strive to reach beyond what mankind is and become human. That is entirely what my art is about.
Nice.
I mean, it's a very, very deep aspect, right? That in a sense, to have that is you have to have obviously a heart, but you always have to have doubt, because being self-critical always presents a doubt, because there's always, like I said, the unspoken wonderment that's beyond your understanding. So unfortunately, when you live as a true human being, there is a dimension of tragedy in your life, because you always know that you yourself are flawed. That when you get into a power, even as a powerful position that control things, you have to understand that you are not perfect. You can make mistakes. And so therefore, you have to understand that otherwise you do construct yourself as a kind of perfect person that can have a system that will live forever, you know? And I think that creates a kind of a desire to explore the unknown, and also, in a sense, be able to bear this sort of anxiety that comes with it, which becomes, in a sense, a tragic sense, because you're never going to reach the perfection that you are. And I just think that most people find that hard state to live in because nobody really wants to live a tragic life.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
that's all there is. I mean, you want to live the good life. And I think that's why it's very difficult, even on a very deep level, of how you could become a true human being, because you know that woven into the good times, there's the tragic times. I mean, beyond your personal tragedy, there's also tragedy throughout. And you have to bear witness to that and understand that and sustain yourself to continue on to reach beyond who you are. And I think if you don't have that basic instinct, then it becomes really problematic. That's why it's really much easier to fall into a system, because it just makes the life easier. Now, obviously, some people are caught in tragedy even though they don't want it. But those people who achieve a kind of success, they don't have to live in a tragic life. They have the yachts, they have all sorts of things. And I think that's that luring of not being bought off by, in a sense, this concept of earthly heaven, or even heaven itself. I just think that heaven, it does not make you a true moral person. You're just being bought off, right? You do the good thing, not because you want to do the good thing, it's because you know there's going to be a big payday someday, and you're going to get it. To really be a good person, a moral person, you have to do the right thing despite the personal tragedy you're going to suffer. That is difficult to ask anybody to do.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
The only perfect people, Phil, are dead people. And
Yes.
they're not even.
Well, maybe that's why Socrates chose to die.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then maybe not.
Right. Yeah. The life of striving, the life of trying to do better, knowing that good enough is like what we wish the human condition could be like is out of our reach. So we're aiming to make things better. And
constantly, and that's the goal. And
the goal.
And once you see the challenge as a part of your existence, that is not a burden.
Yes.
Yes.
So thank you, Phil. That was good. So let's talk about principles. You know, when we've talked more about the Douloi and the Banausoi than we have about the Aristoi. We've talked more about Begriff and Verstand than we have about Vernunft, right? We've in both cases we've talked about, if we take the example of Vernunft, we've said the point of the third mode of thought, the capacity that we have, but that we don't use at first. The point of that is that it reconciles the problems with the other two modes of thought, right? And I've said, and I don't know if it's stuck, but I've said before, what we're striving for is not a balance, right? That what we want to be is not somewhere between these two. That it's not a spectrum, and we don't want to like find some balancing point. And we also don't even want just a shifting balance between them. That the problems that they have are deeper than that. Mm-hmm. It's not. This is not a problem of extremism. In the modern order, as part of the ballast of our civilization, we teach that extremism is bad and centrism or moderateness is good. And anytime somebody becomes extreme, then they become violent and do crazy things, and they're a force of chaos and the law has to deal with them. That's our model, right? Our model is stay in the center of the herd and then the lions won't get you. And we use that model over and over. You can see it in stories all the time. The Disney Falcon and Winter Soldier series that just wrapped up Friday night. made that a centerpiece of its argument. There's some characters in it who have a good cause and they're trying to do the right thing, but they become extremists, and because they became extremists, they become violent, and because they became violent, that makes them the bad guys, and so the good guys have to fight them. And there's more going on in the story than that, but that's one of the central arcs of the story, and it's because it represents a dogma that we have. And that dogma, therefore, it's natural for us as moderns to assume that if it's bad to be too Begriff and it's bad to be too Verstand, then the good must be somewhere in between the two. And key to this concept from Hegel and from the Greeks is that that is not the case. That the problems with the two is not a problem of extremism. It has nothing to do with centrism or extremism. The problems with the two mentalities is that they are unhinged from nature and they uproot us from nature. In both cases, they are too limiting and too ungrounding, and they cause us to make terrible mistakes. So we've talked a lot about how Verstand does that, about how we escape out of a connection with the world and our feelings into these ideological systems that seem to make sense in their own terms. And then we try to live as though the world were that way instead of how it actually is. And we've talked about how perverse incentives and the like can cause us to disregard the evidence that would allow us to escape those systems. And instead we get this Procrustean bed where we are able to reinterpret all the evidence available to us, to suppress some of it, to over-exaggerate some of it to make it seem more important, and thereby to construct what looks like a constellation of evidence that proves that our system is correct. That is, we rationalize the system instead of criticizing it. We aren't it's almost impossible for reason to distinguish when it's doing one versus the other, which makes it too easy to do the wrong one. And with Begriff, of course, the problems with Begriff are evident in every infant. You know, they do not have enough control over themselves or the world around them. They're too immersed. They're too much of a live wire. They suffer life so completely that they have to have a family around them to keep them alive. They would die without the family constantly working to keep them from collapsing under their own Begriff weight. And it is only as they, moment by moment, day by day, week by week, month by month, develop the Verstand side of their mind that they gradually get control of themselves and of the environment around them, and they reach that amazing, charming child state where even though they're tiny and like a miniature person and they can't really survive on their own, you actually don't have to be there all the time, and they can feed themselves and get dressed and go to the bathroom. And it's sort of amazing when you contrast that with just a couple of years before, there they were unable to do anything by themselves because they were too immersed in life, right? So no adult human, well, hardly any adult human beings are at that level of Begriff. But there are certainly plenty of people who live in a very Begriff way, in which the Verstand that they've developed in themselves is only to serve their Begriff motivations, if that makes sense, right? So all of the systematizing that they've done, all the control that they've developed still serves their appetites and their feelings. And that's how they go through their life. And in the modern era, they exist that way because we cultivate them that way. And then those feelings that they have that are controlling what they do are in turn controlled by other people, which is how advertising works, and PR and political campaigns and all the other things are designed to. We've created this mass of people who are covered in levers and buttons and switches, and then when we need something from the great masses, we reach out and push the button, and then they come out and vote for our side, even if our side is actually bad for them. But hey, we win because we knew where their buttons were and we pushed them. They were created that way in order to be useful. There's this artifice to the modern doulos that was very different long ago, before we got so systematized, before we learned how to harness the Begriff immediacy as an unnatural resource, as an engine for driving civilization. And then at the other extreme, we have all these systematizers who who look upon that life with contempt, who do not want to be that manipulated, who do not want to be that helpless, and who struggle to discipline themselves and educate themselves and get as far away as they can from that pathos that they were born into, and to become architects of their own lives. right? They leave the world of pure soul, and they also leave the world of partial soul of the modern doulos into a world of hyper spirit, where it's all focused on the movement, the choice, the construction, the artistry, poiesis, on the creation of the self, the designs for the world, the development of strategies for how to change things to get them where we want them to. This is that noetic Verstand lifestyle that modern civilization is built around, because these are where the rules come from, right? We may have more douloi than we have banausoi, but really the douloi are not in charge. The whole point of them is that they're useful to the banausoi, and that the banausoi know how to manipulate them to get what the banausoi want. It's you occasionally get a Trump who slips through, but it's rare. Usually who gets up to the top of a corporation or a presidency is going to be somebody who's a banausos, who's hyper Verstand, who's hyper noetic, who understands systems and how to get things done. Because with a system this complex, if you can't immerse yourself into that system and think in its terms, then you don't know what its resources are and how to manipulate them to get what you need. You have to merge with the system in order to use it most effectively. And of course, that's the hazard, because we think that when we're doing that we're still in control and that we're just using the system to accomplish ends. We fail to understand the extent to which the system imprints itself upon us as a template, and we start thinking in its terms instead of the terms that we had before. And so we can no longer be said to be in control of it in any sense after we merge into it. We become at least partially symptoms of it, a phrase that Kenneth Smith likes a lot and uses a lot. He constantly talks about the people, are you an individual or are you a symptom of something? So the problem with these things is not that they're extreme. There isn't a nice place in the middle. The problem with them is that neither of them is a valid world strategy. It might work for a few centuries, but it isn't going to work indefinitely. Each of these has its own problem. The begriff doesn't get enough control over itself. The dualic approach to life is too chaotic. It's too driven by the feelings of the moment, the beliefs of the moment, the perceptions of the moment, and too much by trying to adapt to the world instead of changing it. The problem that we face is that there's some things we should adapt to, but there's other things we should change, right? If the tiger's coming hunting for us, we shouldn't adapt to being its meal. If we want to survive, we have to learn how to control that situation in order to not be the meal. And so we need to get out of a purely begriff mode. We have to. But if we go too far the other way, we lose touch with the world. And now we start living this artificial life in which we can systematically and powerfully transform things so that they become non-sustainable, non-regenerative, and we endanger ourselves and everything around us. But we don't see it because of our perverse incentives and the way we've been trained to see the world, such that we suppress into the background the things that our life actually depends upon and bring into the foreground the artificialities of the system that we manipulate in order to get what we think we want. So there is this, they're both problematic in distinctive, essential ways. Each of them is not, they're not at the ends of a pole. Each of them is at the center of itself. Right? Each of them offers a worldview of everything from its own perspective. It's in the middle, not at the end. Extremism isn't the issue. The issue is there is nothing that you can do, no matter how extensively you develop the Verstand life cycle, that's going to overcome its deficiencies. Those deficiencies are also its strengths. The sword has two edges. Yes, you can cut the thing you mean to cut, but you're going to cut yourself too. It's inescapable. They both go hand in hand. It's the nature of the thinking that allows you to organize people on mass scales, that also allows you to think of them as resources and put some of them into concentration camps. They're natural. They come from the abstraction. It's an inevitable result. They both are inevitable results. It needs a check upon itself to keep itself from reaching some of the conclusions that make sense in its own terms, but don't make sense in the world's terms. And the same is true of begriff the other way around. Right? The way that you look at the world from a begriff dualic perspective is complete in the sense that it can have an opinion on everything, just like Banausea can. And it can model everything such that it makes sense from a dualic worldview, but it's just not sustainable and it's not complete. So what this means is when we talk about the idea that Verstand under a Hegelian system arises out of Begriff, and that Vernunft then arises out of Verstand as a reconciliation of Begriff and Verstand. The reconciliation is not an average, it's not a compromise, it's not a balance. It can't actually be expressed in any way understandable either to Verstand or to Begriff. It's alien to them both. From its perspective, it understands them both because it has incorporated them. It's the fruit that understands the blossom and the bud. But the bud can't understand the fruit and the blossom can't understand the fruit. Neither of them can see it coming. It doesn't make any sense in their terms. Each of them is inclined to misinterpret it as a defective form of itself or as the other thing that it's in opposition to. Are you with me so far?
Yes.
I haven't said what it is because I'm spending a lot of time talking about what it's not in order to help us get some leverage against the most reasonable, obvious, logical, compelling, but false interpretations of what Aristeia is and what Vernunft is. It's not any of these things, and it can't be expressed in their terms. It is indeed truly a third faculty that we're born with, but it's only a potential faculty, and we only get to it by struggling for it. And we only struggle for it by struggling through the other stages, just like Hegel said. It's not possible to understand the deficiency of a Begriff until you live a Begriff lifestyle. And only then do you start to pull out and generate a Verstand lifestyle. And it's not possible to understand the deficiencies of a Verstand lifestyle unless you've lived a Verstand lifestyle. And the problem is, at the same time that that's true, it's also true that when you're living one of those lifestyles, they're also inclined to deny that they have deficiencies. They're inclined to assert that they're self-sufficient. And that if you don't feel good in this lifestyle, that's not a problem with Verstand. It must be a personal problem. You need some therapy, right? It's on you. It's not on Verstand. Our system is perfect. We live in the greatest of all possible countries. And if you don't like it, get some therapy. We're number one. There is this way in which each of these things is also an ideology that denies the possibility of its own incompleteness and denies that there's any viable alternative that you should be looking for. So with all that laid out, I can then start to talk about what Vernunft is and what Aristeia is, and therefore what principles are. But before I do that, I see Donald's got his hand up, so I'm gonna call on him.
I don't have any critique of what you're saying, but in some of the discussion of these topics in this paper, Kenneth talks about idiotism.
Yes.
Or
Yes.
being an idiot.
Yes.
And this term has been taken over in modern English to be somebody who's stupid or not too bright or whatever, but it's used here very much like, as you're saying there, because an idiot could be a douloi or a bonosoi or whatever. It's from the Greek idiotes, that where you are focused on yourself, because here's one reference where he says monadic idiotism.
Yes.
It's that limiting of your horizon, your scope of what you think concerns you.
Yes.
And the heuristic personality is an escape from these limits.
Yes.
So that's enough.
You're winding up beautifully. This is perfect. This is perfect. Great setup. So yes, what Donald said applies. The problem with both Douleia and Banauseia is that they both what's the word I'm looking for? Canonize, sanctify, deify one mentality, one possible mode of life and perspective on the world that a human being can have, as though it is complete, necessary, sufficient, and even great, and you don't need anything else. And it's because while each of them claims to have special insight into the world, what they really are is deeply leashed to oneself. So the doulos is leashed to his own feelings, his own perceptions, his own experiences with the world, and that can help to root him in the world more successfully than a Banausos is rooted to the world, right? Because one of the Achilles heels of Banausea is that the Banausos is escaped out of that into this abstracted life. So there are strengths to the dualic perspective and the dualic mentality, but the weakness is believing that that's sufficient, that that's all there is, that you don't need anything else, or if you do anything else, it's just a little polishing around the edges. Fundamentally, while thinking that they are more in touch with the way the world is, what they really are is more in touch with how they feel, and how they feel has become God. That's become that's all we need. This is the monotheism of the feeling life is the dualic state. And by the same token, the systematizer, the analyst, the intellectual thinks that I think, therefore I am, right? My thoughts are me. They're the important part. And those feelings, like Kant, they're like, that's some messy stuff. And, maybe I'll allow it, but only as a background, only as some color. It can't be it's not me. I'm not that messy, horrible person who used to poop himself and couldn't feed himself. I'm this awesome controller who runs, corporations and governments and so on. I am all these things I can do and decide, right? And that's sufficient and necessary and good enough. And they think that because they think that by being systematized, they are objective, and that sure, the feeling life felt the world more, but the thinking life sees the world better, objectively, purely, scientifically, in an advanced way, right? And that therefore that's all you need. And what they're failing to understand is they are every bit as much a prisoner of their thoughts as the doulos was a prisoner of their experiences and their feelings. And that as a result, both of these are forms of escapism. They are escaping from the actual world that we're born into back into the self and the mono perspective that is militating against the development of multiple mental perspectives, that is militating against the possibility that we might be incomplete and that there might be something really, really important that we need that can't be found in here, that can only be found out there. And that
Rick.
Yeah, Ginny, go ahead.
I've been having so much problem with my computer, so I've been going back and forth from my computer to my cell phone. So anyway, but there was a comment that you made, and I don't know how to raise my hand with my cell phone, so sorry about that. But
go right ahead.
Well, you made a point. You made a comment just a few minutes ago about plants, how blossom does not communicate with the.
Yes.
Did you say? Yeah. And my question is, how do you know, Rick?
So the idea, it comes out of Hegel, and
okay.
It's more of a metaphor than the actuality,
okay.
But we can use what's actually happening. A lot of the details are helpful here, which is that when you look at a bud and you look at a blossom, they seem to be two dramatically different things, right?
Okay. So you're just making a metaphorical statement, because the latest studies have found that plants are sentient beings, and they they're quite amazing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm really glad to see these breakthroughs with our understanding of plants.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah. They are astonishing. But yeah, no, here, this is a reference to Hegel's critique of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis was developed before Hegel. Kant had it. And Hegel didn't like it because he said it's too arbitrary. It's based on the idea you could put any two things together into conflict and then reconcile them into a third state that's a synthesis of both. And he says that has all the hallmarks of the Verstand mode of mind that thinks it can control everything. And that the truth of the world, of nature, is a state of organic unfolding in which the antithesis isn't just something you happen to select and pit against the thesis. The antithesis actually develops out of the thesis. So there would be no blossom if it weren't for the bud. The bud is a precondition for the blossom. and that the resolution between the two isn't to go backwards and find some space between them, but it's the further development into the fruit, which is why plants even have buds and blossoms in the first place, is to get to the fruit, to get to the seed, to get to the successive plant, to create the generations of life. That there is this successive unfolding through stages that's happening that's more profound than thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And he doesn't give us any great terminology for it. So in this course, in the series of seminars we're doing, we just keep hitting that terminology he uses, bud, blossom, and fruit, as our shorthand for these things. So the idea is that Banausea unfolds out of Dulea, just like the blossom unfolds out of the bud. I'm gonna just post this here. So, but that the critique that the Greeks have and that Kenneth Smith has is that Dulea and Banausea are both forms of idiotia, because in both cases, while you can, and most of them are, they believe that they have some higher thing that they worship. In both cases, if you were to take a Socratic interrogation of them, you would discover that what they're actually worshiping is their own experience or their own ideas, respectively, depending upon which of these two traps of the mind they've fallen into. They're either worshiping how they feel about God, or they're worshiping what they think about God, because they're stuck in this perspective in which one's own things are more important than the rest of the world, right? This is what the Verstand and the Begriff share in mind, that unites them. Even though they think that they're in opposition to each other, they're actually united in the sense in which they both turn inwards, away from the larger cosmos around them. And it makes them parochial. It makes them unable to do the thing that Kenneth Smith says is the core of philosophy, which is learning to dislocate the joint of the mind and turn it back around to look at itself and hold itself accountable. They don't do that. They just take the self for granted as right. Or they take part of the self for granted as right, the intellectual side of the self or the experiential side of the self.
Isn't it also a form of egotism? I mean, human beings are so egotistical,
Yes.
And when you think about plants, again, going back to plants, they're not very egotistical in the way they exist.
Right. And we've got a lot to learn from them, right? We do, because one thing you can say about most plants is they are rooted, right? They don't have any problem at all with this thing that gives us all kinds of problems. They know how to stay connected.
Yeah, well, think of all the things that plants gives us. They don't take anything from us; they just gives us things. When you really think about it, plant life. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's pause here for James and then Phil, and then I'll play my gambit that we're working up towards. What is a principle? James, go ahead.
Yeah, what you're just saying, it sounds like the conservative movement. The two groups.
Yes.
Going inward are trying to conserve what they have.
Yes.
And they don't want to change. They don't want to grow. They don't want to individuate.
Right.
So they're not concerned with the rest of the world. They're only trying to conserve what they have.
Exactly. All forms of idiotism, under the Greek sense of the term, are forms of egotism that are about. I don't have Lord of the Rings. There's a critique of Lord of the Rings, which is that all the bad things that happened in Lord of the Rings were the consequence of the elves trying to stop time and stop change, and creating these great artifacts that would allow them to create places that did not age, that could exist forever in a happy state, and that by doing that they unleashed evil upon the world. It's an interesting subtext that you see in the Silmarillion that isn't openly talked about in The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. But idiotism, all forms of idiotism, are based on that same misguided attempt to say, this is the way everything should be. I'm going to try to suppress everything else and just make this the whole, this part. There's an abstraction involved in both cases, because it's an unwillingness to deal with the whole picture.
Yes,
which is
natural is it has to embrace the principle of change and self-destruction.
Yes.
has to turn into the flower, but in order to do that, the bud has to die off, right?
Yes.
Or the caterpillar, comes out of the what do you call that?
The chrysalis.
Chrysalis, and but that chrysalis has to die before the caterpillar can emerge, right?
Yeah, it has to be willing. This is the thing that Hegel talks about. It's in Lectures on the History of Philosophy. The section that he wrote about Heraclitus is great insight into Heraclitus. He says that the brilliance of Heraclitus is understanding that the resolution of the great challenge of being and non-being, which certain ontologists have struggled with, is Heraclitus. It's becoming. It's saying, yes, I am constantly alive because I'm also constantly dying. The old me is being replaced by the new me, and that's okay. And furthermore, it's desirable. That growth is a good thing. I shouldn't be so terrified of the loss of the old me that I try to stop progress and freeze in place, because that freezing in place is a more profound form of death than even death itself. It becomes a stasis and a sterility. Phil, and then Donald. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, you the way you put the Trinity, I hate to say the word Trinity, but it's interesting how the triangle fits. I mean, as you're talking, with my limited knowledge of Egyptian myth,
yeah,
there's also a triangle, but it's sort of somewhat upside down. I mean, there's Amun-Re, who's really in some ways in the background, but he was the origin. Well, before that there was the earth, but he was the origin god that created his sons, Osiris and Seth.
Yes.
And being an agricultural metaphor, myth, and it seems like Osiris was given to rule the earthly realm of men, but his brother Seth was important, and he wasn't destroyed because he realized that it was necessary for measurements to take place for societies to survive. But overseeing them was really Amun-Ra, who, although was in heaven in the background, he was the one that ultimately controlled the cosmos in a funny way. So, but the reason why it's kind of upside down is because it started with the origin rather than things evolving in a kind of constantly changing into a more and more. It seemed like a metaphor of unfolding.
Mm-hmm.
It also had its dynamics, but the important part was at the beginning that unfolded into a more complex layer.
Yeah.
That unfolds more into a more complex layer. But there was a kind of evolution, but in reverse, kind of like growing a tomato plant upside down.
Yeah.
But it's just sort of interesting that it wasn't reduced to just a duality.
Yes.
From the singularity, it became a duality, which then unfolded the multiplicity. And in this case, is if evolution as it unfolds and unfolds more, or I should say evolves more, it evolved into a multiplicity, which means is much more diverse forms that are created. But they had that in, I guess, in a way, and that's why it was important to, in a way, control death of the Egyptians, because you have to sustain rather than, let's say, just let it evolve. You have to sustain the origins in a way. So Osiris always had to sustain the underworld in order to revive the world again. So it's kind of interesting that in some ways, Egyptian mythology is actually more complex
Yes.
than we currently have it, right?
Yes.
Which, we think, oh, those ancient times. It's kind of like, I wonder whether that was partially because, well, partially was the geography, but I wonder partially wasn't that it created a sustainable system that could maintain itself, without Amun-Re having to interfere too much.
Yes.
In that sense. So it's just kind of interesting. It's not a polarity as you talked about, right? And quite often we make the mistake, and the mistake was really in a sense the exclusion in the middle.
Yes.
You can only compromise that. But in fact, if you took a line and you just unfold it into 3 points, there you go, which is sort of interesting. And the 3 points are connected to each other. Well, at least the top point, which is Amun-Ra, is connected to the other 2 points.
It's what's so interesting about studying things like that is the deeper you get into it, the more you start to understand how there is a dogma in modern civilization that says that everything before it was more primitive, and that the farther back in time you go, the more primitive it was. There's this idea that we're the most objective and the most sophisticated, and and that it's more or less linear. And of course, as Sharon says, it's not true, right? I mean, there's that idea of evolution has been overthrown. That idea of history needs to be overthrown. But increasingly, even understanding that idea of philosophy and religion needs to be overthrown, because what we find in some of the very earliest, oldest references we can find is, as you say, often a clearer picture of the dialectic than we find in everyday modern civilization. So more, the Egyptians seem to be more comfortable with the dialectic than most people are today, which is, thousands of years ago. It's just astonishing to find that we've moved, if you think of the understanding of the dialectic as progress, that we've moved backwards so far, such that in many disciplines, such as in evolutionary biology, in my own lifetime, evolutionary biology has gone from the linear view of evolution to the understanding that it's not linear and it's not a great march of progress. It's only recently that we've thrown off this modernist dogma, thereby discovering for the first time what the ancient Egyptians knew a lot thousands of years ago, right? There's a Edward Dahlberg, If These Bones Could Talk, and he's got another one that Kenneth Smith likes to quote, where he's saying, moderns are always congratulating themselves on how advanced they are, because they're always discovering new things that everybody but them used to know. It's hard for us to grok. All right, Donald, go ahead.
Makes you wonder why we're so enamored with being progressive.
Yes. Towards what, right?
That's just another delusion.
Yes.
But I wanted to say to James, and I'm not sure, I don't know James, and I don't know to what he was alluding, but I caution against applying what Kenneth says about Greek-eristic society to contemporary political events in the United States. I mean, it's certainly clear that this is not an eristic society.
We're hostile to it.
Hostile to it. I dare say that I don't find eristic politicians where I live. I don't see them elsewhere.
No.
And certainly the current debates that we have in this country are not debates among aristos. They're basically banausic debates. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know. I know that he in his writings, he clearly jumps on I'll just say Republicans a lot. But when I've asked him about that, he doesn't defend any other parties either.
Right.
He doesn't say, yes, give that up and go join this group.
Right.
It's because they are a kind of an archetype where the things are more clear.
They're such great specimens.
They're a good specimen for your political laboratory. So I know I was once at a kind of a seminar at his home in Dallas. I don't know if you were there or not. I don't remember you, but
I was not.
We went to lunch, and somebody in the car, and if you're here present, said, well, gee, why don't these douloi and bonosoi just recognize that these aristoi are superior and how this hierarchy works and let them rule? Well, I said, the douloi and the bonosoi, they've got their own hierarchies.
Yes.
And the aristoi don't come out on top.
No,
they come out as these, idle wasters that want to be supported by the society so they can sit around and think they're pure thoughts or something, In any case, or like there's a Heinlein short story where the sewer workers show everybody who's really in charge of the
yes.
society.
Yes.
I'm not, so I just think, I don't think this is, Kenneth is pointing to systemic problems in a society that's basically driven by economics.
Yes.
And what it can hope. So it's driven by economics. Those that really understand how that works, the bonosoi, they pretty well dominate.
Yeah.
And I would not want to stand up, were I an Aristos, and say, you evil bonosos, you should be stripped of everything. I think I would soon find out that I didn't have the police, the army, any major corporation. I would probably, my own wife would desert me, because a lot of hurt would be coming.
Yes.
I would finally get to see the levers of power.
Yes.
As
they grind you underfoot.
As they grind me under. So if that's James, if I'm totally irrelevant, just ignore what I've said. But I just go on and talk about the RK, please.
Well, I will in a moment, but first we have a line. So I think Sharon and then Dave.
Well, one of the questions I have, or one of the observations I'm making with the douloi and the bonosoi being in itself and being for itself, is the accompanying lack of insight, which accompanies the character type.
Yes.
Because I think that the president we just had was being for itself. There was nothing outside of that. Yes. There was no insight into his personality at all. That was just his archetype.
Right. He was quite a specimen. As Donald said, part of the reason why Kenneth likes to go after the Republicans is because, the Republican politicians so often are so transparent. They either say exactly what they mean or they say exactly the opposite of what they mean. But in any case, you get a very clear picture of either the world that they would like you to believe in or the world that they actually do believe in. And as a result, it becomes this interesting illustration of principles of Bonosea and Doulea. The Democrats tend to be more sophisticated in their approach to these things, even though they too are moderns and are, caught up in the same systems as the Republicans are. Especially, again, we're talking about the Democratic leadership, the Democratic power base, how the economics work, where the money flows, who gets it and who doesn't get it, and all that stuff. That's where it becomes the most nakedly transparent what's actually at stake. There's a huge difference between what people are willing to say to try to motivate their voters and what they actually do when they're in office, once they actually have to pull certain levers and fulfill certain promises that they made behind the scenes. So Kenneth picks out the ones who make it easiest to see. But if Republicans didn't exist, Kenneth would spend all his time going after Democrats. It's just like, both of our parties are part of a modernist system. So, you work with what you've got to try to illustrate the what's at stake. All right, Phil.
Very well said.
Go ahead, Phil.
This reminds me of an interesting thing, again, that happened to me at Penn State. I studied with two main philosophers, and they were both excellent, but they were in opposite poles. And I liked them both, but I didn't want to get involved with their politics because they almost hated each other. That might be a way to put it. And so this one Plato scholar, and he's very good at Plato. He really taught me quite a bit about Plato because I don't read that much. And he was at this particular lecture, sort of as a brief aside, he was sort of criticizing Heidegger. And he said, the trouble with Heidegger is that you just want to ask them a simple question. Do the philosophers know more about shoe than the shoemaker?
Right.
Right. Okay. So that's seemed like apparently easy question to answer. And he said the problem with it is Heidegger, instead of saying something reasonable and understandable, he would just say, the shoes. And he made this sort of gesture like shoes, right? Like, go away. Like, the shoes. And then this other philosopher who later on, he wasn't responding to him, but he was defending Heidegger. He was kind of Heideggerian. He started with Kant and Heidegger, and then into what's his name? Emmanuel Levinas and so forth. And he was saying, he said, it's the dancer who understands the shoe because he knows how to use it. Now, he did not exactly say these words, but I'll put my understanding into that. It is the vortex that understands the shoe.
Yes.
But when the dancer dances, he is the one that discovered the vortex that moves in the world, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's a dynamic understanding of what a shoe is versus a mechanical understanding the shoemaker understands versus the diagrammatic or analytical understanding the philosopher may have. Mm-hmm. So that was a very, very interesting argument. That it wasn't a direct confrontation. They weren't fighting each other for that, but he was sort of saying, no, you have to look at the dynamism of this thing. Mm-hmm. And who discovers that vortex of anything?
Yes.
It's a thing that is important, that truly understands what the thing really is. So I thought that was just a total insight that changed from an analytic to a static to a dynamic understanding of the world. So
that's beautiful. Thanks, Phil. Dave, go ahead.
I just wanted to dilate a little bit on what Donald said. And this is one of the things I like the most about Kenneth Smith when I first read him with this group is the respect for the prehistoric cultures or pre-modern people. And on page 14, I'll just read some of the language, but we should value these people. Why? I think he really summarizes it well. He says we should value them because they're more in touch with myth that expresses a form of life not segmented and vivisected as ours. And that's why I told the story about the volunteers when they came out of the cave. They experienced a sense of timelessness. Imagine living a life that is not constantly vivisected by the hour, the minute, and the second of the day. What would that even be like? Could you even imagine that? You couldn't unless you actually lived in a cave for 40 days as those volunteers did. And so it's a life in which soul still understands itself to be immanent in nature and understands divinity to be immanent in both nature and soul. Yes. I really thought that was just such a very valuable way of talking about why we should appreciate these prehistoric cultures and why it's not proper to view them as backward or somehow lesser to the modern way of thinking.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it is something that Kenneth does a lot, that takes some getting used to, especially for moderns, that he refuses to play along with our insulting of everybody before us. He refuses to play along with the whole, let's raise ourselves up by denigrating the people who came before, the civilizations who came before. And instead, he's doing that ancient Greek thing where they didn't fight wars over religion. They were fascinated by different religions. They're always like, tell us about your gods, because maybe our pantheon's missing somebody. We'll match up the ones who match up. And then if there's you've got somebody we don't have, we're like, ooh, we're missing one. Let's add that. Because the whole point is to understand the cosmos and our place in it, and what are the powers, that have authority over us. And we're not claiming to understand it all, because then we would be gods. We're struggling to learn it. And that means we're constantly looking for discoveries and insights that'll show us what are the potent forces in the world that we really better attend to if we know what's good for us. So yeah, he takes that approach to these ancient civilizations and is constantly pulling wisdom out of them and showing us things that we took for granted and ignored or willfully misunderstood, as is frequently the case, in order to keep reiterating the story that they were primitive and we're advanced, and that the forces of history inherently make us better by birth, which is part of the modern dogma that we don't talk about so much.
And by extension, then you really have to call into question the entire concept of progress itself.
Yes.
Specifically scientific and technological progress, which we as a culture have a tendency of fetishizing.
Yes, we're obsessed with means, but we don't talk much about ends. And as a result, we will often create great potent tools and hand them over to dictators to use against us, and then be shocked that didn't work out well. Well, we got 3.5 minutes left, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to really introduce the heuristic, the arche, the principles, and what that's all about. We may have to punt that for next time, and include that as part of our discussion. So I guess maybe a better way to wrap up is say, those people who put together notes on this essay, do you have notes we didn't get to that you'd like to hit for our closing moments of today, and draw our attention to? Any potent Smithisms that we should take a moment?
There were a few. I think we previously maybe discussed them when we first kind of went over the essay, but the one I think that maybe requires some clarification is his mention of the Crystal Palace, like corporate crystal palaces. So what I'm kind of using as a benchmark, because I think people are going to be kind of lazy. So I'm reading this on like a Kindle device, and it kind of pulls it up from like Oxford's Learner Dictionary, and so it's just very factual, and I think kind of devoid of what I think Kenneth Smith is trying to signify. So it's just like a crystal palace is a very large building made of glass and metal, designed in 9 days by Joseph Paxton for the Great Exhibition of 1851, took 6 blah, 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 in London. So I'm reading his reference to the Crystal Palace through his earlier mention at the beginning of the essay from Dostoevsky, and in Notes from the Underground, the Crystal Palace is mentioned, and like it's based on something real, right? And like
yes.
It's this kind of symbol of like of this optimistic confidence in human rationality, and like the underground man is like kind of rebelling against that idea, and I think like through like is that's how I should be interpreting that?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Kudos to you for pulling in the Dostoevsky. You just know Kenneth means the Dostoevsky here. I think there's also a subtext of, I don't know that Kenneth's even read this, but do you know the book The Cathedral and the Bazaar, or those concepts from computer science? Based on the idea that you often get these people who want to be in charge because they'll do it right and perfectly in their isolated little, cathedrals away from everybody else, but that actually it turns out they're much less productive than the messiness of the bazaar, where everybody can have a go at it if they want to, and there's this creative cross-pollination and ferment. There's more liveliness in the bazaar, which results in more good things happening than there is in the isolated, pure, perfect tower. References to crystalline, in Kenneth Smith always make me think about that overly organized, overly homogenized, too too perfect to the point of brittleness kind of connotation. And that's a lot of that's in the Dostoevsky reference. So
sometimes in computer science, they talk about the MIT approach versus the Berkeley approach.
Yes.
That MIT is all good enough, and Berkeley is we have to get it perfect.
Yes.
Engineering versus academia.
Yes.
So before we go, I just want to go to the top of that paragraph that Richard mentioned.
Yeah.
It's about Goya and his etchings, because that I thought was very, very powerful. The sleep of reason breeds monsters truer than he knew.
Yes.
That I thought was very, very good. Would be a good discussion.
Yeah, I mean the image just springs right into our minds, doesn't it? It's he's using words to paint a picture here, and it's a potent picture.
Because everything is based on reason and rationalization.
Yeah, and that's where he turns the intent of the painting on its head. And when he says, the wakefulness of reason is indeed no more than a lucid dreaming, he's doing that Heraclitean critique in which reason considers itself objective and awake, whereas Heraclitus responds, you only think you're objective and awake. In fact, that objectivity is the dream you're having, the belief. You're dreaming that you're like God and that you're all powerful and see things the way they really are. But if you were awake, you'd know that's not possible for you. And therefore, that's all the evidence you need that you're still asleep. And that what you're calling consciousness is actually another form of unconsciousness. You're still not awake yet. And where this gets interesting, and we'll have to do this this particular line of investigation another time. I've been thinking about it for a few weeks. Is that one of the knocks against Socrates that Kenneth Smith has is that Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living for a man, and it asserts the idea that anything that hasn't been rationally investigated is worthless, or worse than worthless. It's dangerous. And that's at the heart of Kant. When Kant rejects all traditional sources of morality and emotional sources and unconscious sources and insists on conscious morality, this is his attempt to systematize what Socrates said. And it leads into this ultra-Verstand, worldview. The belief that we should be able to exist without that messy, icky, unconscious, emotional stuff. But the archaic Greeks, Heraclitus and other people of that era, knew that it takes both sides. You can't purify things and just have reason stand on its own, because then there's no ground. The ground is made up of decaying soil, complex things that we don't understand, but without which we couldn't survive at all. He says ethics are the same way. Epistemology is the same way. He says this was the fundamental mistake that Socrates made, is that Socrates was overly noetic. He thought that you could reduce it all down if you just analyzed it and critiqued it and questioned it. And the truth of the matter is far messier than that. That, reason wouldn't even be possible without this unconscious, pre-conscious, messy stuff. And that's where you get into Hegel with the bud and the blossom and the fruit.
And Kant uses the term pure reason.
Yes, right, because he wants to finish that Socratic project and create a purely examined life that's therefore worth living. Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up.
I just want to briefly go back to plants. It used to be we thought of plants as being maniacal to a certain degree. The big trees cast a shadow over the little trees,
right,
to prevent them from growing. There's a struggle in that sense. But now that we find out that they understood, they had a community. They communicate through the roots. They actually share things that we didn't know. They were giving the carbon and so forth. So they were much more sensitive about giving to each other and supporting the community than we ever thought they were.
Yes.
More than we are. We're not
nurse logs.
Nursery logs, yes.
Nurse logs.
Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, and the new discovery that the old trees, when they themselves can't use the resources available to them, are pumping it out to all the little seedlings around them, trying to help them grow.
Right.
I won't always be here, but I can help you.
And apparently, if a tree or some sort of plant needs certain kind of chemical or component that they don't have, they will ask
Yes.
other trees, and the other trees will send it to them. Or
It's amazing.
I don't know how they would communicate, but somehow they do communicate apparently. And this scientist on NPR have recorded them making sounds to
Yes.
communicate. Some incredible machine that they were able to use to read the plants, the way they communicate underground. That is just so phenomenal.
Yes.
That human beings were able to come up with inventing such machines to record such things. And so we're pretty amazing too, human beings, but we're finding out that plants are pretty amazing creatures out there.
Yes.
First place I saw that was in Olympic National Forest in Washington State. I
Yes.
love the hike there. Love it. That's the only place I think I really saw the community of plants and how they support each other.
You can't miss it there. I mean, the nursery logs in the Olympics are amazing, but so are all of the ferns, the licorice ferns growing off of the trees themselves, right out of the bark. It's just, and the moss everywhere, helping to hold the moisture in to keep it all. Yeah, it's incredible the way that it's just this complex
perfect
network.
ecosystem there.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is why when we attack the rainforest in Brazil, and burn them down and all that, it is just what we're doing, what we as human beings are doing is very, very selfish, and right?
Yeah. And short-sighted. It's that kind of stupid selfishness where we're even working against our own interests in the long term by up, raising up and deifying our short-term interests to the point that we're willing to sacrifice all these living things and therefore ourselves as well in order to raise our quarterly profits and make more money.
Yeah, like burning the rainforest down, thinking that they can farm it and grow wheat or something, and it turns out the kind of earth, kind of soil that there underneath it is not conducive to regular farming.
Right.
It was meant for rainforest, meant for the the way
it had the right ecosystem there.
Exactly.
But even more importantly, that's the lungs of the world.
Yes.
Well, there's also interesting story about truffles. I mean, they have to grow next to a tree.
Yes.
They're supported by a tree.
Yes.
And look what happened to human beings. We have these truffles, and now apparently there's a truffle mafia that steals truffle from each other because it's so expensive. I mean, this guy said they didn't take my money; they just took my truffles, right? And now, now the Chinese are exporting a cheaper brand of truffles to Italy and to France, and the dealers are mixing it in.
Adulterating your truffles.
So, like, we just exploit things. I mean, that's what human beings are good at.
That's that modernist mindset. It's our reflex, right? But people have done different things in different eras. This is a particularly.
So next week we'll continue this number 3, right?
Yes, and we'll talk about principles and Aristoi.
Yes, because I found all those points that you made, those metrics that you brought out.
I see what you did there.
Quite interesting. They were able to relate to the essay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon.
And as always, very educational, Rick. Everything
pleasure.
that you said. Yeah.
Of course,
Thank
Rick.
you, everyone.
Thank you,
everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Donald, you have a co-philosopher there in Donald and Phil.
No, but Socrates did point out that you can't expect dialectic to work if there are limits on the conversation. Those include what form of defense or examination can occur, or how long the conversation can occur.
That's right. That's right.
He was willing to talk forever, if that's what it took.
That's why we do these week after week.
Well, obviously, you don't have any understanding of the topic sentence.
You just need to read that first paragraph, huh?
Well, I like to make a confession because last week, I am not a philosopher at all, never had a class, but last week I got a big aha moment from Phil. So when he talked about asking questions and then you get the answer and then you question the answer, well, that's the whole range of philosophy.
Yes.
From the beginning of time. And in fact, I think Kenneth Smith talks about it here in the second paragraph, where he talked about the origin of philosophy and how it just compounds on itself. And so each philosopher comes with a slightly different perspective of the one before, but it's very relevant to the time in which he's living, because the times change.
Right.
And so we are exploring that and looking back and looking forward, right? And applying it to the times in which we live. So that's how much philosophy I've learned since I've been with you, Rick.
It's good. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great week.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right,
Thank
bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, everyone.